All right. Hello, folks, and welcome to our stream here. So today I have a guest, James Shore, who's going to pair with me on this yacht dice game that I TDD'd way back a couple of years ago. Yesterday I streamed and added a bunch of things. It was very interesting. So you can watch that on my Twitch videos, video on demand. So today we're going to look at nullables. So I'm going to let James talk about that.
All right. Yeah. So nullables are an approach to testing code that is different than mocks and fakes and spies. Really, what it is it's a way of doing sociable state-based testing, which is an alternative to sort of the standard mock-based approach, which is isolated interaction-based testing, which has its benefits, its pluses and minuses. All engineering is trade-offs. The benefit of sociable state-based testing is that it is very real, in that with sociable testing and with state-based testing, if you make a change down deep in your dependencies and it changes behavior that your test cares about, your test will break. Whereas with isolated tests, with interaction-based tests, what they're checking is that they call the dependencies, but not that the dependencies work the way your test thinks they will. And that can lead to subtle bugs. So I like sociable state-based tests quite a bit. Some people call it the Chicago school of testing, and the interaction-based test, the London school of testing. I like it. I find it easier to write. I find it simpler, but it does have this question of, well, what do you do when you're talking to the outside world? How do we not talk to the outside world when you need to? And to solve that problem, I invented what nullables, which are a way of turning off those interactions while keeping everything else totally real. So I think it will become more clear as we get going, but I believe, Ted, you've got a link set up where you can link people to my Testing Without Mocks article about this.
Yep. So I'll punch that command in.
Yeah, it's on my website. If you search for Testing Without Mocks and James Shore on Google, you'll get to it. I've got a whole article about this for those of you who are watching the VOD. By the way, you were going to record this video so I could put it up on YouTube, right, Ted?
Yes. So it's already recorded.
Excellent.
Recording. Yep. So what you see is what you'll get.
Excellent.
So you'll have to forgive me if, as I fumble around, this is the first time I've done a live stream with pairing, with Zoom, with all the stuff that has to be wired and knitted together. So bear with us.
Yeah, it's all an experiment. Yeah. I've also been, for those of you who really love this stuff, I've also been doing some pairing with Matt Wynn of Cucumber fame. And you can find those videos on the Cucumber YouTube channel, which is Cucumber BDD, I believe.
Yeah, and I actually keep meaning to catch those, and then you did another one today, and I was like, oh, I got to finish this last thing.
Yeah. We did live stream that. We did that live stream earlier today from 11 to 12:30 Pacific. So that's actually almost done. We've pretty much finished the work.
Cool.
We've coming out the other side. Now we just get to delete all the code that's no longer necessary because we're using nullables. Because he wrote a fake he has a little bit of code to manage who can be a part of the contributor team in GitHub. They have a sort of a archive team of past contributors and current contributors, and he wrote a GitHub action to automatically move them from one to another after a certain amount of time had passed, and using the GitHub tooling. Right. And so what we did was we turned that into the wrapper that he written, the adapter for that. We turned that to use nullables, and we're able to get rid of the fake that he was using to do the testing on that previously.
Right. Cool.
Yep. Go ahead.
No, I was just responding to Wheatlaw on there. It's like, I've turned off the dark mode redemption, so no worries about, apologies to those who are where it's like 10 o'clock at night. We're gonna be light theme here.
We could
So
do that next time, though, I think. Let's see.
yeah, I
Oh,
didn't want to,
I
I
don't
didn't
have
want
my
to,
live stream mode set up to do a dark mode.
yeah,
I
I didn't want to have that jump out at you. So I
yeah.
put those on pause.
For those of you who love dark mode, sorry, I'm a light mode fan.
All right. Should I intro a little bit about the current state of the dice game?
Yeah, I think that'd be a great idea.
All right.
Why don't you share your screen so I
Yeah,
can see
let
what
me
you're
share
doing?
your. I always forget. You can't see what I'm seeing.
Yeah, well, I am currently looking at the
There we
the
go. Okay.
Twitch channel, but I think
That's going to be really not good to see it on.
yeah, and it's also delayed for me by about
Exactly.
5 seconds.
Yeah. All right. So everyone should see. Let me switch this up here. Oh, thank you, Zoom, for swapping stuff. This is where it will be fun. There we go. Now we're all there. So this is a game, dice game. You may be familiar with Yahtzee. The idea is you roll 5 dice, and then you try to score them in different ways. So the technology, the stack is basic Spring Boot, timely for the HTML templating, all done test driven, and the code is organized with hexagonal architecture. So I'll go a little bit through what the different pieces are, but let me run it so you can sort of see what that looks like. And let's go to here.
I love your color scheme here.
Yeah, so this is the 1980s color scheme. I use it for all my games.
You didn't want the light mode was not enough to make your viewers' eyes bleed. You had to go with the yellow on blue as well.
That's right. Well, hey, it's a slightly dark background, so. So these are the different categories we can score in. We can roll the dice. So the first roll, we have 3 1s and a 3 and a 5. So the idea is that each category is scored differently. 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, etc. are scored based on how many of those values there are. And then there's a poker-like aspect, full house, 4 of a kind, and so on. They're scored in different ways. So we click the checkbox. No fancy UI here for the ones we want to keep. The rest get re-rolled. You have up to 3 re-rolls. Holy cow,
Whoa.
look at that, all ones.
Yeah,
So
amazing.
let's score that.
That's
so
5 points.
That's
Big
5
money.
points. Big money. Absolutely. So that's the game, and you keep and I fixed the bug that I had discovered the other day of unintentionally assigning roles to multiple categories.
Yeah.
Absolutely, Ryan Tufo.
So
Yes, God tier CSS.
yeah, and it's actually working, right?
Yes.
You've got this basically totally done. So what are we going to do with it?
So we have a couple of options. So one, let's talk about the random dice rolling, because I think that's the thing that we'll start looking at. So right now, so in hexagonal architecture, we split out things that are what we consider sort of core application domain, right? The rules of the game, how things get scored. And Lexler is the point of the game is to you can play against others. Right now it's a 1-player game, so you're playing against yourself. And so the idea is all those rules, the scoring and dice reroll rules and things like that, that's part of the domain. And so that's basically everything in here. So we see dice roll, we see game, we see scoreboard, categories, all that kind of stuff. There are things that, from a testability standpoint, make things difficult. One of those is random number generation,
Right.
because by definition, right, they're not predictable.
It's global state. The actual there is, it's a pseudo random number generator, or
Right.
it's relying on the cryptographic generator,
Right.
and that is state that's held inside the computer, not inside your code.
Right, and that's a really good point, because one of the things that Hexagonal says is everything inside the hexagon, so the domain application code, should be completely ignorant of basically any hardware. And so the way I talk about it is the only thing it should be aware of is CPU and RAM. CPU so it can execute instructions, and RAM so it can read and write to internal state. But rolling a die and using the random number generator, that's hardware. Some people call that, with a generic term, infrastructure. I don't do that. It's just hardware.
I call it infrastructure.
Yeah.
I'll admit it.
Yeah. And to me, the reason why it's like infrastructure always sounds like, this big cloud thing. But like sometimes there's things like, what's the current date and time?
Yeah,
that's hardware.
That's global state.
Yeah. So I actually like global state. So we'll try to use that terminology.
I mean, there's global state, there's external state.
Yeah.
Like if you're talking to a web service that has its own state,
right.
It's not global exactly, but it is external state.
Yeah.
So you've got this, I see on the left-hand side, you've got a dice roll class, and you've got a die roller in the application, and then you've got a random die roller adapter up above. So how do all these things fit together?
Yep. So the die roller is in hexagonal architecture, which is also known as ports and adapters. It's a port. So what this allows us to do is not code against a concrete random number generator. We code against an interface that represents what we want from our global state, our infrastructure, our hardware. And what we do is whenever we want a die, it turns out the dice roller is the thing that wants that. So the dice roller, it's in charge of doing a full roll of all 5 dice, handling a new roll as well as a re-roll where you only re-roll some of them. And so right here, this is where we get the die that, and we basically sit in a loop for how many we need, and we go and call the die roller.
Yeah, and this is happening at the application level, not in the domain.
Right. And so that's something that was cause for some really interesting separation of concerns. So before actually the modifications I did yesterday, the domain actually called the die roller, and that was accessing hardware. And so the way I structure hexagonal architected code is inside the hexagon, there's 2 things. There's the application layer and the domain layer. So the domain layer is the pure rules. The application layer is the thing that orchestrates. So it's the thing that goes out and fetches information, passes it to the domain, executes stuff, and then maybe queries the domain, takes that information out, and then throws it maybe at some external service. So here we can see that the application code goes and requests this information, and then it actually passes in, let's see, so dice roller return, let's go and track this back.
And do you consider the ports part of the application, or do they just live inside the hexagon?
So I consider the ports part of the application layer. They are, and that's why I have the port nested under application. So it's the interface gateway sort of to the external world.
Right. And then you've got a domain layer, and then the implementation, the adapter, lives outside the hexagon.
Right. And so I put all of my adapter implementations in an adapter package, and then I further subdivide them. Actually, these need to be renamed. This is an outbound adapter. So typically I sort of categorize adapters, at least outbound ones, in 3 ways. Where I'm fetching information, where I'm sending information or notifying, or where I'm doing basically repository rewrite stuff.
And there's also inbound adapters too, right?
Right. And so the view and the web are inbound. So those are what trigger stuff to happen in our application.
Okay. So I've drawn a little picture based on what you're talking about. I have to admit, I don't feel like I truly understand hexagonal architecture. That's partly because Alistair Coburn has been talking about it for a long time, but for a long time, whenever I did a Google search for hexagonal architecture, it would direct me to his website, and the article was not super clear.
No, it's not.
But so is that showing up clearly on the camera?
I can see it, but that's because I'm seeing the full view of the camera.
Yeah, I imagine whoever's
Yeah.
online probably can't see that. But yeah, and I don't have a way of quickly sketching stuff out on the computer. Can you make the do you have a view that would
Yeah.
show me bigger?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's do this. Next time I'll have a special view for that. So that's a little bit bigger. But yeah, basically, so the way I think about it is I split up the adapters.
Hmm.
So let me sort of show how it relates to. So this is from my course on hexagonal architecture, and this is why I created this course, is because I've been using it for a while, and there's a lot of nuance and a lot of stuff that's not clear. So here, each adapter is independent, and so we can consider I consider sort of the domain, this central core, really nested deeply inside.
Right.
That is not only doesn't connect to hardware, infrastructure, or global state. It isn't even aware that it exists. Right? Random numbers, it doesn't know how those happen. It has no idea of a random number generator. It just says, somebody says, here's a roll, go do something with it. Then the application layer sort of surrounds it, and that's where sort of these ports are. And that's the sort of the orchestration and interaction with the outside world. It still doesn't have a hard, concrete dependency, but it is aware of the fact that there is an external world, there is a database to read and write from, there is other things, and it gets triggered then by the inbound adapters. So one of the things I do like about hexagonal architecture, the way Alistair talked about it, is that there's this sort of left to right asymmetry. That stuff happens, comes in from the left side, does stuff, causes things to happen, and other things may happen then on the right side. And so I very much like that sort of layout.
Okay. Let me talk a little bit about, so what we're going to be doing in this live stream is we're going to be introducing nullables, but we're also going to be looking at A-frame architecture, which is another way of thinking about it. And that part of the reason we can do that is because nullables lead to simpler structures than ports and adapters do, and than mocks and spies do. So we won't need ports, for example, when we're using nullables, because if there's only one implementation, you don't need an interface. Whereas if you're using mocks or fakes or spies, then you do need an interface. You need an interface to sort of represent either the real thing or the fake thing. But with
Right.
nullables, it doesn't work that way.
Right.
So if you could allow people to see this picture that I'm holding up to the camera. So this is A-frame architecture. It's called that because it looks like an A, and in physical real world architecture, you've got the A-frame house, right? And it looks like a giant triangle. That's why this is called A-frame architecture. It's very simple. I like simple things. There are some similarities with hexagonal architecture, and there's also, but I'd say it's more similar to imperative shell functional core, which is Gary Bernstein's approach. I'd say this is more of a formalization of imperative shell functional core, or functional core imperative shell. What you have is you have an overall application layer, which is responsible for being a traffic cop. You have a logic layer that knows nothing about the outside world and is, if possible, purely functional. And then you have an infrastructure layer that's responsible for talking to the outside world in every way that the outside world can be talked to. We don't make a distinction between outbound and inbound. So one abstraction could represent the things that both go out and that go in. And the main thing here is that infrastructure is not aware of logic, and logic is not aware of infrastructure. All the mediation happens at the application / UI layer.
Right.
The fact that logic could be purely functional, but is completely unaware of the outside world, is very similar to the domain that you have in your hexagonal architecture. I would say, actually, you've done a very pure implementation of hexagonal architecture here, so there's not a lot of differences between imperative shell, functional core, or A-frame architecture.
Right.
The main difference is, I think, just conceptually where things live,
Right.
rather than there being an inside of a hexagon and outside of a hexagon. There's a traffic cop, which sits at the top, which is the application code. And then there's the domain and the infrastructure, which are both subservient to that application code.
Right.
And there won't be any ports at all.
Right. Yeah. And so
But I think to start out with, we're just going to make things nullable because the nullables can work in any type of architecture.
Right. Yeah. So one thing I was going to say is, and one thing that I know that the difference is also, which I didn't touch on, is the test for this stuff. Mm-hmm. So the port, the reason it's an interface is basically there's a stub. And so this is a little bit what you're talking about is here, there's a separate class in a separate, not a separate package, but in a separate directory. It's in the test directory. And it's what we use when we want to test the code and we don't want to rely on random numbers to generate our numbers.
Yeah. Now, since you have a stub here, I'm guessing that your tests are not interaction based, but are in fact state-based tests.
They are right? Just about every single test. There is one which I've currently turned off because it's actually now there's an issue with it that will need to be fixed. But yeah, in general, my preference is for state-based testing. I do very little sort of behavioral interaction testing.
Yeah. Well, that is my preferred style as well. So I'm a fan. Although because you're already doing state-based testing, I think the advantage of the nullables is going to be less clear. You've got something that at first glance looks really clean here, and if this was a real world environment, I'd say it ain't broke, let's not fix it.
Right.
It's good enough.
Right.
But what we're here to do is show how are these things different. But when I demonstrate this, I do demonstrate it typically in comparison to interaction-based testing because the differences are more stark in that environment.
Right.
Should we get started? Where do you want to go from here?
Yeah. So we actually didn't talk about how we're gonna pair. But if you want me to drive and you navigate on how to take the existing implementation and make it nullable, that's one way to go.
Yeah. Now, at one point, as we were sort of talking about this before we got started, we talked about having there be more infrastructure to sort of make it more interesting and talking to a web service, like posting our scores to a web service, which we are not going to make secure in any way whatsoever. So people could just post whatever arbitrary scores they want, I suppose. But did you have a chance to do that?
So I had the server running. I didn't implement any code for it. So I thought what we could do is up to you. We could do a nullable version of the random thing, or could implement the posting of that information to the external service with Hexagonal and then with nullables, or do it right away with nullables. So that's kind of the choice.
Well, let's start out with the die roller.
Okay.
And because I think that's already in place and it will give us a point to start. I want to start out by sort of demonstrating the downside of using test doubles. Now, technically, nullables have some test double-like characteristics, but they're different. And so if you would do me a favor, and I see you've got the stub die roller, if you could, where's your code that uses stub die roller? Do you have a test that uses stub die roller that you can show us?
Yep. So let's do this one.
Okay. So yeah, if you could run just these tests.
There we go.
Okay. Now, if we go to the real die roller, and now this is a very simple example, so this is going to seem really contrived. But what I find is that to make a good adapter, or I call them infrastructure wrappers because I like really clear, stupid names. So we've got infrastructure and we've got a wrapper around that infrastructure. Therefore, it is a infrastructure wrapper. And guess what happens when we make it nullable? It's a nullable infrastructure wrapper. So we have an infrastructure wrapper. And what I find is that to make good infrastructure wrappers, we don't want to just randomly or explicitly mirror the third-party service or tool. What we want to do is have some logic to sort of map what it does to what we care about, right?
Okay.
So we will have some stuff in there. We'll have some logic, and that logic has behavior. It has semantics, and that behavior sometimes is different than what our tests expect. So to simulate that, what I'd like you to do is throw a runtime exception that says, says something.
So in here in the real roller?
In the real one, yeah.
Okay. So.
And what will happen, and I haven't tried this with your code base, but what will happen in in sort of more complex code bases, you'll make a change that changes behavior. You'll update the test for random die roller in this case, and they will pass. And you'll think, okay, good. And you'll run the rest of your tests, and they'll pass. And you think, I'm fine. But what's actually happening is that you've changed the behavior, and so the code that depends on that behavior is actually broken, but your tests don't pass.
Right.
I don't know if that's what's going to happen here because you do have sociable state-based tests, but I'm guessing because you've got the stub die roller that they will fail.
Yeah, so I'm going to run all the non-IO tests because those run just as quick as any amount of tests.
Okay, so we do have some failures, and that's great.
Yeah, so there are some tests that, so I use stubs when I care about how, in this case, how the randomness affects the state. Sometimes I don't care, and so that's why there's a smattering of some test failures, because here all we care about is that after true rolls, then we can re-roll one more time. So here, using the random one, that's fine. It was cheap. Right. It is true though, I only do that because it's cheap to get a random number. If this were calling an external service, which is something that we'll do, then I would never use that in a test that is sort of at this level.
Yeah. So go back over to your yacht controller assign roll test. What happens if you only run those tests?
Yeah. So if we only run these.
Okay.
So
again, same thing. Some of them are passing, some of them aren't, because you're using the stub in some cases and the real thing in others.
Right.
Yeah. And of course, again, I think that's because this is a little bit artificial. If it was actually what's more common, talking to a database, talking to a service, you'd be using the stub in all cases.
Right.
So that sort of illustrates the reasoning behind using nullables, which is that we want to have our test be sociable. A sociable test, as you know, Ted, is a test when you run the test, it actually runs all the real code all the way up to the boundary, the edge of the application memory. So once it leaves the process, then we don't want to keep running it. Right. But we run all the way through. Whereas an isolated test, a mock-based test, it only runs the system under test and then nothing else.
Right.
So what nullables are is a way of getting closer to the edge than what stubs allow us to do. And of course, much closer to the edge than isolated mock-based tests allow us to do. So yeah, you can go ahead and reset that or put that back. I just wanted to demonstrate, why do we do nullables? Right. Because of course, everything's trade-offs, and there are some things about doing nullables that I guarantee some percentage of the people watching this they're gonna be like, and they're gonna throw up a little bit.
And I might do that myself a little bit. Yeah.
We're gonna lose some of the audience forever. They're saying, Ted, how dare you bring Jim on this show and put this abomination out in the world?
How could you?
But
we trusted you, Ted. What happened?
Yeah, what my life has been a lie. So yeah, there's trade-offs to everything, and one of the trade-offs is nullables is that what we're going to do is we're going to make the real adapter be able to be turned off. We're going to turn off the outside world, and that is going to involve writing code that right now is only used by your tests. Now, it turns out I've done this a lot in in my real production code bases. And that ability to make things nullable it is useful in production code. If you've ever used a null logger, you know how making things nullable can be useful. One thing I do in my production website, which is jamesshore.com, is when it starts up, I need to warm the cache. I need to make sure that certain paths are in cache and going. So I use the nullables to do that, to warm it up without actually serving anything out or making any external calls. So those nullables do become useful, but when we start doing this, what we're going to do is we're going to write code that's only used by tests, and it's going to be production grade code. And some people are not going to like that. And there's a trade-off.
Yep.
I think the trade-off is more clear when your code is uglier, but you have nice code here, so that's good, I guess.
I always say it's like, an expert, someone who knows their craft really well, can make anything work and nice. But, not everybody wants to spend 20 plus years getting that good or can afford to. So yeah.
Well,
eventually more guidance is always helpful.
Yeah. So let's start looking at making this random die roll nullable.
All right.
So we're going to start out at the infrastructure layer. So that's going to be your random die roller adapter. We're going to make it so it can be nulled out. Now, the neat thing about nullables is they are completely compatible with other approaches to testing. You can actually have a nullable based, you can have something be nullable used by a mock-based test. You can have stubs, and you can actually even have a test have nullables and mocks in it at the same time. So it's very, very easy to incrementally introduce nullables without breaking the world. So that's what we're going to do here.
So one thing I want to make sure is so you're using the word mocks, and as you know, that's a ambiguous term, or means different things to different people, certainly. I just want you to define for folks, when you say mock, what exactly do you mean?
Yeah, when I say mock, it's usually shorthand for mock or spy, which is in contrast to a stub, which is what you have here.
Okay.
You want to pull up your stub real quick?
Yeah.
So a stub, of course, is the mock, stub, spies, fakes that are all examples of test doubles. And a test double is an implementation of interface that is in contrast to a real production implementation. So on the right, we have the real production implementation that does a real random number thing. And on the left, we have a stub, which returns a predefined set of values. So that's a stub. It implements the interface, but doesn't do anything real. It just returns hard-coded values. A mock, well, a spy is an implementation of interface that just tracks how it's called and also returns predefined values when it's asked to. And then you can ask the spy, well, how were you called, and make assertions based on that. And a mock is sort of a complicated version of a spy where you say, I expect you to be called in these ways, and then you let it be called. And then later on you ask it, hey, were you called in these ways? And it will say, well, yes, or it will say no, and it'll blow up, throw an exception. But they're all just different ways of writing tests that don't run the real production code, because there's something about that real production code that's expensive, or you want to do interaction-based testing, where what's important in your test is how your system under test interacts with other objects, rather than the changes in behavior that the system under test creates.
Right.
Is that
great?
Is that a good description?
Perfect.
Ted?
Just want to make sure we're all on the same page.
So,
yeah. All right.
So what we're going to do is we're going to make the random die roller nullable. And what it means to make something nullable is that we're going to have it behave just like the real thing in every case, except the part where it talks to the outside world. Now, your random die roller is so simple that it's a little hard to do that in an interesting way.
Well, doesn't have to be super interesting. Gotta start somewhere.
Right. So go ahead and pull up the random die roller tests.
So I don't have tests that there are tests that use it, but there are no tests that test it.
Okay. Probably because one is really simple and it's really hard to test.
Like, what would I mean, I could write a test that does statistical sampling, but it's not my job to, but basically that's testing the random number generator. That's not my job. So I don't think I have any tests that are testing it. Oops, that are testing it explicitly.
Okay, well, let's create a test then.
Okay. I'll just call it that. So one thing, excuse me, one thing I do is as you noticed, I split my screen, so I have tests on the left and code on the right, so that way both are up at the same time.
I do something similar, except that I keep my test tab on the left. I just have the two file tabs next to each other, and I sort of switch back and forth using a hotkey. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to write a test that says that let's see, how do we want to do this? So ultimately, what we want this to do is when we're going to have the ability to create this in a normal mode, or we're going to have the ability to create it in a null mode.
Mm-hmm.
And when we're creating in the null mode, it's not going to talk to the outside world. If this was a service, we would stop it from actually talking to the outside service.
Right.
So in the case of this, we're going to prevent it from talking to the random number generator, which is the external state.
Right.
So we can just decide how we want that to behave. But what we want to do is we're going to write a test that calls some function that turns it into a null and puts it in null mode. Usually I do that through a factory method. I'll have like a static create null method on the die roller. Do you want to go ahead and do that? Do
Sure.
it that way? Yeah, let's do that.
So we'll do a static. Let's go return. You want me to turn the actual random die roller?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it'll be a factory method.
Yep. And so what should I return for that?
Just return a new random die roller for now.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, most of the time I've been doing this in JavaScript. And because JavaScript has sort of weird classes, I just put, I use create as my sort of standard factory method for creating everything in JavaScript. And so for me, there's a nice parallel between create and create null.
Right.
I don't know if you'd want to do that here. You could make the constructor private and put in a factory method for create as well to create some symmetry.
Let's see how much that's used, because I think, wow, are you erroring it? Yeah, we can do that.
Okay.
So let's make this private. So Wheatlaw says you can keep it public for everything else and pretend it's private for this test.
Well, the reason to make it private is just to create some symmetry.
Yeah.
On the nice thing about that is now it's really explicit whether you're using something that is has been nulled, or is real.
Create, turn, let's do the same. And let's go find out where it fails.
So there's a good point in the chat. They're saying it has to work with whatever inversion of control setup you have.
Yes. So it turns out, luckily, that's not an issue, because the inversion of control, because random die roller is infrastructure that Spring Boot has no concept of, it doesn't care about. I manually provide that. So what we'll do here is we'll just say, actually, I'll pull this out into a variable, and then I'll just say, great. So problem solved for inversion of control.
Okay. Yeah,
let's find all the other places where
it's IOC frameworks for exactly that reason. They add a lot of complexity that is often not worth it in my mind.
Yeah, with Spring, it's basically take it or take it or move elsewhere.
Yeah,
But what's nice is
which I mostly did.
yeah. What's nice though is in any pure separation of which hexagonal is one. My application and domain code have no idea of Spring. Spring is completely external. So any interesting any inversion of control that's gonna happen is going to be at the Spring level where it actually is kind of useful. Mm-hmm. If you're going to buy into it, then you're going to buy into it.
Yeah.
So let's go and replace.
And that's actually been one of my big beefs with Spring in the past when I've looked at it, is that it really wants to own the world, and you buy into a lot of complexity when you buy into it. So while you're doing this, Ted, I'm going to go get myself some water. I'll be back in a moment.
All right. All right, there we go. Let's do commit. Actually, let's go on a. Yes, fine. Let's go on a branch. Actually, let's. And let's do git commit. Start of nullable. I don't know if James will like that as a word, but nullabilizing is what we're doing. Die roller. Changed to static. All right, so I'll do that. We'll commit. So that'll give us a place to restore from if we need it.
All right, I'm back.
All right. All right, so what's next?
So all our tests pass?
All tests pass.
Okay, great. So yeah, let's go back to our die roller test.
Let me just close some of these. There we go.
By the way, when I've tested random rollers before, I've sort of like, it is possible. I've done Google searches, or keep saying Google, but I use DuckDuckGo. I've done web searches for ways of testing it. It is possible to like do 10,000 rolls and then do a statistical analysis on it.
Right.
I've looked at that and said, no, thank you. That is way too much work. But what I do care about is what you've got on line 24 on the right here, which is that we've got the right range.
Right.
So I will have, the way I've tested is I've done like 10,000 rolls. I've recorded the minimum and the maximum. I've made sure that I've got the right range.
Right. And actually, Wheatlol earlier in the chat said you can test the first 100 numbers are in the range 1 to 6. So
yeah,
right on.
Exactly. That's how I do it. And then you want to make sure they're integers as well.
Yeah, that's not a problem in Java because it can't be anything else than an integer.
Oh, right. I'm saying next int. Next int. Yeah.
Typed to rescue.
Yeah, I'm used to random number generators that create a floating point between 0 and 1, which is pretty typical, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so, but we won't bother testing them that. So what we want to test is we want to test that create null, or, well, so let me talk this out with you before you write it down. We basically, we're not talking to the outside world. We're only reading from the outside world. Mm-hmm. I think you made a distinction between different types of outbound adapters.
Right.
I don't remember what you said.
Yeah, I call them fetchers. So this is a fetcher. It's fetching information from the outside world, and notifiers.
Right, right. Where you're telling the outside world something.
Right.
Yeah, and I don't make a distinction. Like if I've got a single service that can tell me things that I can tell things to, and that can also send me events, I will make one adapter, one wrapper
Hmm.
for that
Yeah.
because conceptually it's a single service and I want to treat it in that way. And so again, that may be a little bit of a difference between
Yeah.
A-frame and hexagonal
Yeah, because
architecture.
hexagonal, the way it says is that I don't care where this information came from and I don't care where this information goes to. They are sort of oriented around how they're used and what is triggering them. And in fact, a question came up on my stream yesterday about WebSockets. And so in hexagonal, you'd have two adapters. You'd have the inbound one that's handling incoming requests from the WebSocket, and then an outbound one that's sending out information over the WebSocket, even though it may appear it may appear to be a request response. It's
Yeah.
really not. So yeah, that's a
And
difference.
Matt and I have been talking. Matt Wynn and I, Cucumber guy, have been talking about this, and he's a big fan of hexagonal architecture. And we were sort of talking about, well, what is the difference? And I think one of the things that I would say is the difference is that A-frame architecture is not very prescriptive, whereas hexagonal feels a little bit more bureaucratic. This is you put things
Definitely,
here,
definitely, yeah.
and sometimes what you're going to do is, in order to satisfy that bureaucracy, you're going to do things that are kind of uncomfortable and don't, they potentially make your life harder. Um, so with A-frame, if it makes sense to make two infrastructure wrappers for the same thing, then
Right.
do it. But quite often it doesn't. It makes sense to think of this is a single conceptual unit. I am talking to this thing in the outside world,
Yep.
this, you know, this socket IO server, and I'm going to treat it as a single conceptual unit.
Right. Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely. I don't know if it's the correct term, but I'm a prescriptionist because
mhm.
I like that. Like, where does this
Yeah.
go? I know exactly where it goes, and it goes in this tiny little bucket, and I don't confuse it with something else. And it's definitely a different way of looking at it.
And there's a lot of benefits to having a prescriptive approach because that means that you're going to have consistency. It's easier for beginners who need
Right.
that sort of prescription recipe based approach. Um, and I think you can say I could create a prescriptive recipe based approach for A-frame architecture. I haven't because mostly it's this and this is it. I'm like application logic infrastructure, that's it, go
Right.
wild.
Right.
But I could make it prescriptive and I could say, well, every external system gets one class as its infrastructure wrapper. Um, but even if I did do that, I would say that it's a little bit less bureaucratic than the
Mm-hmm.
hexagonal approaches.
Yep.
But regardless, so yeah, what we're talking about is a fetcher here. And so when we make the the null version, really what we're doing here is we're saying that we're going to control what comes back.
Mm-hmm.
But to start out with, I think we want it to just, um, we have a couple of choices. We can say that if we haven't defined anything, then it's going to throw an exception. Or we could say that the null version always returns the same number, like a 6 or a 1 or something like that. And do you have a preference on that?
Let's go right to that. That it always returns unless otherwise specified some number.
Okay. So yeah, so null roller always returns the same number, same returns 1 or same number or something like that.
That's the one.
Okay, and then I think you know how to write that test.
All right. So let's roller create null. Sometimes the suggestions IntelliJ suggests are like, what are you talking about? And so what we're going to do is we're going to assert. Assert roller row is equal to, we said 1. All right. When you run this, it's going to fail. Oh, we don't know what it's going to do.
It will fail randomly.
It will fail randomly.
Sometimes it will fail, sometimes
It
it
will
won't.
succeed randomly. Yeah. You kidding me? That time it passed? I don't believe you. Let's run it again. All right, there we go.
there we go. So it was,
I didn't trust
yeah.
it
So I
until
mean,
I
this
saw it fail.
illustrates why we need to control it perfectly.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, now to implement this, one of the things about uh, one of the ideas behind nullables is that in an interaction-based environment, if we're doing interaction-based testing as opposed to state-based testing, interaction-based testing, we think of the interactions between our objects as important, interesting behavior. And in the state-based environment, we think of the implementation and the interactions as implementation details. That's to be encapsulated.
Right.
So the way we program this create null is an implementation detail that nobody outside of the implementation of random dice roller or die roller is going to know about
Right.
or care about.
Right.
So the dumb easy way to do this would be to set a is null flag on a random die roller and check that inside of roll.
All right. So let's just
Just is null. The whole thing is nullable because it has the create null.
So let me do this. Okay. Let's go create that field. Boolean. So now how do we set it to be true?
I think just a flag in the constructor, right?
Yeah, so let's do this. So this one is going to be true. Go ahead and add that as the parameter. I'll set the false to false.
I would have expected that to default to false.
I think I put it in the wrong thing. All right, and let's assign this.
Okay.
Funny, it can be final.
That should work.
All right, let's see if it works.
Run that a few more times.
How many times? Let's see. How many times do I need to run it for it to be statistically significant that we think it works?
I have no idea.
Somebody
10
out there
probably.
figure that out.
Yeah.
So BozTech in chat says, my understanding of classical hexagonal architecture describes repository and notifier port types, but they're always outbound. Ports, since it's 10 mentions, how they're used, including who starts the conversation. Right. So yes. So that idea of who starts the conversation, which is why I talk about inbound versus outbound. The classic hexagonal architecture terms use primary and secondary, which I always get to me confuse me a bit. Certainly driven and driving are also a bit confusing. So that's why I use inbound, outbound. But that's right. The inbound adapters are driving. They start the conversation, they trigger things that happen. And as a result, these outbound adapters, we ask them for information, so we fetch them, and we may send information out. A fetcher wouldn't necessarily be a read-only repository, although that is actually one way to look at it. The typical thing is you're just requesting information that you need. Usually I'll represent a repository as a somewhat larger interface because there's going to be multiple find methods on it.
Yeah.
All right. I feel pretty confident that this works.
Yeah, I'm fairly confident too. So of course this was a bit of a parlor trick because doing this is null thing is it. I am not a smart man. It takes me time to learn things. And when I first tried trying to figure out how can I do sociable state-based test without using mocks and spies, the very first thing I did was I made a global variable called is testing. And then down in my infrastructure wrappers, I had basically what you have here. If is testing, then, blah, blah, blah. And it worked well enough. It was not something I was ever willing to tell anybody I did because it was obviously terrible, but I did it. And
And I did that kind of thing, before, let's just say really early in my career. And
yeah.
yeah, it works well.
Yeah, I did early in my career, middle of my career, and late in my career
Yeah,
because that's the kind of guy I am.
right.
But I never was really proud of it, right? And one of my favorite patterns is the null object pattern. And one day, many, many years after I had been doing this for a long time, it came to me, well, wait, what if I use the null object pattern to do this? But I kept the same basic idea. I introduced the create null. I encapsulated the question of whether this, how is this done? So I got rid of the global variable, which was a definite win. But it still left this sort of spaghetti code, and it left the problem that I'm not really running line 29, which means that if there is a semantic difference, then my test could have a false success or a
Right.
false failure.
Right.
I'm more worried about the false successes, actually, than I am about the false failures.
Yeah.
Although, as we all know, flaky tests are a bane of all of our existence.
Yes.
Um, so this is where I started, and I want to show you this because the real technique I have kind of pisses people off. And I just want to demonstrate.
I'm waiting to be pissed off. That's what I'm waiting for.
I just want to demonstrate how you implement the nullable is entirely up to you. But the best way I have found so far, keeping in mind that I'm not a smart man and I spent years using a global variable, so there are probably better ways. The way I do it was with an embedded stub. And an embedded stub is quite different. It's using a test double, but it's using test doubles different than you've ever seen it done before. What we're going to do is we are going to create a stub of the third-party random class, so that all of our code is the same whether we're using a null version or the real version, so that all of our tests operate against all of our code the same way, which catches any sort of semantic errors that we have.
So that's really interesting because because as folks out there, James and I talked about this stuff before, and it just clicked sort of what's going on. I do something similar. We'll maybe talk about it later. But yeah, I sort of have this sense of squeezing and down to the absolute part where you literally are. That's where you're crossing that process boundary, and then that's what you're embedding a stub around. Does that sound right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And it's called an embedded stub because we're going to put the stub in the production code.
Right.
And we're going to encapsulate it. Nobody is going to be aware that there's a stub except for our guilty consciousness. Right. But
that's
nobody
fine.
who
I can get over that.
What'd you say?
I can get over that.
Yeah. Yeah. It keeps me up at night, but I just cry myself to sleep every night and then I'm happy.
Yeah.
So yeah, anybody who uses random die roller is not going to know how create null works. And people look at this and they say, well, why don't I use dependency injection? Because everybody loves dependency injection. That's because we're not going to use dependency injection. We're going to make that completely invisible. And the reason is that in a more complicated class, what we would do is often the third-party dependencies that we're stubbing have massive interfaces, but we don't stub out the entire interface. We only stub out exactly what's needed for our code to work. And so the implementation of the stub is extremely tightly coupled to the implementation of our production code. And so we want them to live next to each other so we can keep track of those things. And so we don't have to make it super sophisticated. It's going to do just the bare minimum to do what we need. Now, in a dynamically typed language, this is easy. We just make a new thing that has the same interface. In a language like Java, which is a little bit more strict, I don't know how easy this is going to be. Probably what we're going to need to do is create an interface for random and create a thin wrapper around random.
Yes.
In C#, where more things have interfaces, it's a little bit easier because then you just use the existing interface, but Java tends not to do that as much.
Yeah, so we'll have to manufacture basically a next int interface.
Yeah. So let's do it gradually. Before we introduce the stub, let's just introduce the wrapper, make sure everything continues to work.
Yeah. So Wheatlil asks, is random final? I would hope so. Oh, it's not. We could extend it. That would be.
I tend not to like extending classes because then you end up sort of relying. I mean, I don't love inheritance in general,
Same. Yeah.
um, because you end up at least not inheriting implementation, because you end up being so reliant on the behavior that you're inheriting. And if that ever
Yeah.
changes, things can break in really bad ways.
Yeah. 100% agree with you. Live coding says, let's choose to believe it's final. I will choose to believe it's final.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
I will do that too.
So we're saying let's introduce an interface. So let's do this. Let's pull this out into a method. We'll just call it int. And let's
I'm not sure where you're going with this, because this isn't what I was imagining.
So I'm going to see if I can get fancy with the refactoring, but maybe I won't get fancy.
Oh, I see. You're trying to get it to do it for you automatically.
Yeah, I'm not going to do that.
I would probably just start brute forcing some typing if it was me.
Let's just do that. So let's create an interface. We're going to call it random int.
Random is, I think, the standard convention.
Yeah, not in Java. So the question is this going to produce? This is just going to produce the next int given the range, or are we going to do?
So
I'm trying to figure out which part we're going to encapsulate.
Sorry?
I'm trying to figure out what part are we going to encapsulate. So there's a method next int that takes a number that returns between 0 and that number -1. Is that what we're extracting? So
you want me to drive for a minute?
Sure. If you want. I can try that out. So I already did a mob start, so I'm going to do a mob next.
Okay. And I should be able to do a mob start once you've done that.
Yep.
Okay. So let me share my screen. This is the first time we're doing the actual pairing. Let's see if it works.
Let's see.
Portion of screen. Bam. Did that work? You see it?
Let's see. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to pull up. We're looking at random die roller test and random die roller. And how do I put this in its new window? Split right. There we go. Okay, so what I'm thinking is something like our private interface random int. Is that the
sure.
Is that the term?
Mm-hmm.
Actually, no. Let me go one step further. I'm just going to make the real class. We'll have a constructor called. Man, it's been a while since I've done JavaScript.
If you want a constructor, it's just the name of the class. So random wrapper.
Random wrapper, right. Yeah. And we'll do a public random wrapper. And then what I want to do here is return a new random. So we'll have a private, private random. And so this will be random equals new random.
So you'll need to declare that type. And you don't want private there on the class.
What do I want it to be?
Just class is fine.
Okay. Because I don't want it to be exposed outside of this file.
In that case, you'll need to nest it inside of the other class, and then it'll become a nested class.
That's what it is.
Yeah.
I swear, I have programmed Java before. It's just been... I've been doing a lot of JavaScript lately, so it's gonna my habits are gonna be a little bit off for a little bit. And then we're gonna have a next int, which is gonna take a, what is that?
So it's an int. I don't know what it's called. Max bound.
Bound. Yeah.
What a horrible name, bound.
And this is going to have to be an int.
Yep. And the return type on the method also.
That's going to be an int.
And then the class itself, you can make private static. So that way, yep.
There we go. So that should still work because we're not doing anything.
Right.
Remind me how I run the tests.
You can click on the double arrow, or you can click when you're inside the test, Control-Shift-R. Either way.
Command-Shift-R or Control-Shift-R?
Control-Shift-R.
Okay. I ran it, but I'm not seeing the results.
That's because it's still building. There you go.
So yeah, so that still works, but that's no surprise, right? Because I haven't done anything.
Right.
But now what I should be able to do is have this be a new random wrapper and this be a random wrapper. And now, is there a way for me to quickly run the same tests again?
Yes, Control-R.
Control-R. Yeah. So that's what I mean by
Got it.
By a very thin wrapper.
Okay.
What we're doing is we're basically working around Java's requirements. What we want to do is have the ability to make our own version of random, but we can't do that in Java because of its limitations. So we're just going to wrap up what we've got.
Right.
And I would rather not do this because it just adds noise that's not super helpful.
Yep.
So let me go ahead and hand it back to you.
All right.
That would be Mob next, right?
Yep. All right. I'll steal the screen back. And there we go. And do an upstart. All right. So Wheatlow says random implements an interface, but it sounds like it's large, but I'm just curious what the random interface is. So let's go take a look at it.
It implements serializable. So, that's not what we want for sure.
Yeah, so Wheatlow, I'm not sure what... oh, there's probably random is the base class. Yeah, okay, never mind. I thought that was an actual interface underneath. Okay, so yes, we agree this is kind of not great.
Right. But, and these are the hoops we have to jump through in a statically typed language. And I particularly don't love that it's got a, I'd probably put in a lot of blank lines to kind of to separate from our production code. But so the next thing we're going to do here is we are going to make an interface for that.
So that I'm going to use our extract interface. What do we want to call the interface?
I don't know. It's either random wrapper interface or random interface.
I'm going to call it random int.
Okay.
That's basically what it's doing. All right.
Put our interface?
So you put our interface in a separate class.
No, we don't want that.
So let's go and delete it. Yeah, go ahead. Put it in here. Okay, so we've got random int is how it's defined here. We instantiate the random wrapper, and random wrapper implements that. And next int is the method that it implements, and we've got our interface here. Is that what we wanted?
So now what we're going to do is we're going to make the random stub.
Okay.
This is the embedded stub.
All right.
Or maybe you might call it a null random. It's up to you. Usually I call it null XXX, but stub is probably more accurate.
So what do sorry, what do you want me to do? So I'll call it stub random.
Random. How about random stub?
Random stub. Okay.
Yeah.
And so I think I missed a step. Tell me what you wanted again.
Make another implementation of random interface.
Okay.
Called random stub.
Okay. So let's go do. And is this the one that we're going to want to return 1?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And that should all still pass its test because we're not doing anything yet.
Yeah. It's not used yet. Yep.
But now what we can do, if you go back up to our constructors, instead of passing, or in addition perhaps to passing in the is null, we can now pass in which version of the random wrapper we want to use. On the real one, we can pass in the real random wrapper. And on the null one, we can pass in the stub random wrapper.
Okay, so we're going to pass in new random wrapper here. And we'll go ahead and add that as a parameter. And then on this one, this is, what do we call it?
Random stub.
Random stub. And it was overly precise here. And we obviously will want to assign that. Want to create a field for that. Or, oh, that gets assigned to random.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. It's because we said it was final, but we'll take that out. That should work. So
okay, that should still pass.
Yep. Yep.
Okay, now down in our roll function, we can get rid of the if is null and just return random.nextInt +1. And that will fail our test because we didn't implement the stub correctly. It should return 0 instead of 1.
Zero-based numbers.
Yes.
All right.
There we go. So what we've done now, if you scroll up to, and I literally would put several blank lines between the end of the production code and the embedded stub. Well, actually, like at line 29, I just add a bunch of blank lines. What we've done is now we have the same, effectively the same code as before. Go ahead and scroll up so we can see the whole thing from the top.
So we can actually drop the is null thing, right?
Yeah, we can. Let's go ahead and do that.
Let's do that. Yeah, let's do that from here.
We can get rid of that constructor parameter too.
There we go. Run it.
So yeah, what we have here is effectively the same code as before, but now it's nullable. Now we can control what it does. We can control whether it talks to the outside world. And we're running the same code paths all the way up to the very edge of the system.
Right.
So that if you were to put in that throw new exception that we did before, now anything, anywhere that uses random die roller is going to fail.
Right.
Well, except that actually it's not going to be any different because we've got all the existing code using the stubs. But if we
if we change the stubs to use the create null,
So yeah, that's how nullables work. Now there is one additional thing when you're fetching. Like there's other stuff that you do when you are, I forget the term you use, but when you're telling the outside world,
Notify. Yep.
notifying, and there's something else you do when you've got an uh, inbound situation. And again, with nullables, you can have fetching, notifying, and inbound actions all happening in the same wrapper.
Right.
Um, let's do a little bit of cleanup here
Okay.
before we move on. Personally, I'd put the interface before the actual implementation.
Yep.
But other than that, I'm pretty happy with it. And I probably remove some of the white space just because it's so low semantic value, if you know what I mean.
So I'm curious, what you think of, no, that still would be different. So one thing I was thinking of is we want a very specific random number, right? We want it within this bound of 0 to 5. If we extracted the interface where it says instead of just next int, it would be next 0 to 5 number. That would sort of defeat the purpose a bit, because then we
I don't understand what you're getting at there.
So instead of saying our random int interface takes next int in a bound, if we said instead, no, it's just next, int, 0 to 6.
We can't do that because what we're doing here is we are mirroring the third-party code.
Exactly. That was the point I was making. That this would not be a nullable thing because it's not what exists in it's not the thing we're connecting to.
Yeah. I mean, remember the nullable is the what the larger class is capable of. This is just an implementation detail, and a somewhat ugly implementation detail. And so the question is, I mean, all engineering is trade-offs. So the question is the flag uglier / more effective than the embedded stub? And is the nullable as a whole uglier / more effective than an external stub?
Right.
And what you're trading off is, I do think it's little bit uglier than the external stub. I think it's a little bit uglier than the flag in a lot of ways. It's certainly more lines of code than the flag. That equation changes when you've got more stuff.
Right.
But what it is it's more effective in that we do get now the sociable path. Our tests are more real and catch more stuff and give us more confidence. And also, this is less of an issue for your code, but as compared to using mocks and spies, once you've made something nullable, you end up using it over and over and over again.
Right.
Whereas with mocks and spies, you end up creating a new mock pretty much in every test, and that gets old.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I think we should check this in, but there is, I think, some more stuff for us to do, which is, well, what do we do when we want to control exactly which die?
Right. So the programmable aspect of a stub. Yeah. Let's do this. So completed.
I don't know if that's a good name for what we've just done here. You committed before once we made it nullable, right?
Yes.
So I would say that what we've done here is we've converted the nullable dice roller from using a flag to using embedded stub.
Yes. Thank you. So iCopor says 0 can also, yeah, so the random int generates from 0 to 1 less than the bound. That's what's going on there. Yep. All right, what did you have in mind next?
So I think our next test should be that the null roller can be configured to return specific values.
Okay.
And I would probably have it return specific values. So like hand it a whole array of stuff.
All right.
So yeah, now we'll create null and we'll pass in an array of the values we want it to return, and then we'll test that it returns those.
So how do we want to pass those in? We'll just do.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the best way to do that is in Java. Does it have
yeah,
variable numbers?
Yeah, we can
parameters
use
now?
we can use var args for that. Yeah, variable arguments. And so then we'll just do assert that.
Let's not start out with 1 since that's our default.
Yes, good idea. Actually, let's do that. So we got 6. Three, 4, 3. So let's go and change the signature. I'm going to manually change the signature, otherwise it's just going to assume I want 4 ints. Okay, so that gets us at least to a failing test. It should fail because 6 is not 1. Great.
It's interesting. Your tests run a lot faster than mine do. When I was running it, it was taking quite a while to build.
Yours had to build. Once it gets built, then it caches that stuff. So subsequent runs should be faster.
Got it. What computer are you using there?
Oh, I've got a 8 processor Intel iMac.
Okay.
So not a laptop.
I have an M1. I have an M1 MacBook Pro. So it may be also the compiling Java on the ARM chip rather than the Intel chip may be a difference as well.
Maybe. I don't know. The M1 is pretty darn fast.
It is pretty darn fast. I really like it. It's such a good computer.
Yeah. Like I love my iMac. I don't regret buying, splurging for the 8 processor thing. But Apple really knows how to make their chips.
They sure do. So what I would do is I would pass those values through to the stub and have the stub be responsible for figuring out what to do with them.
That makes sense. Create that constructor. Oh, it doesn't matter. It'll all be consistent. All right.
Well, actually, having them come in as an array would be nice because that's ultimately what we need.
Well, so it turns out there's no difference because values is an array, so we can iterate over them or whatever.
Well, we're just going to store them though.
Oh, that's right.
We're going to store them and have netextint pop them off.
So let's go and store them. All right.
Okay.
And
and yeah, so here, if we don't pass anything, it just gives us an array with nothing in it, right?
Yes, it would be an empty array.
Yeah. So what we need to do is say, if the array is empty, return 0. Otherwise, pop the next value off the array and return it -1.
Let's try this. So this should still make the first test pass, and the second one should blow up with an exception. Great. All right, so now gonna have to decide how I want to do.
Is there
there's no array pop or anything like that. So I either need an index or I convert it to something that I can do a remove on. I think maybe I'm going to do that. I'm going to convert this to a list of integer. And then this is going to be it's not values, this new array list values.
We're going to want it to be mutable actually.
Yeah, so let's do. I use arrays so little that it's like, how do I do this again? I think that's right. As list gives us fixed list. Oh, it's backed by the array. But we don't want to do that. We actually want to. What is this returning? Oh, let's do this. Fun with boxed variables. Okay, so now it's not values.length, it's values.size. So that, let me just go back here. Okay, so that was a refactoring. Should still be the same. Oh. Propagate that back. And okay, still fails the same way.
Yep, good.
Now we can go ahead and do values dot remove 0. What the heck? What did you just do?
That was weird.
That was weird. So we think that'll work.
Yeah, I mean, it just depends on how arrays work in Java.
Yeah.
One thing I've really gotten spoiled with in JavaScript is, and also a lot of other tools. Oh yeah, we need the -1. Is that, basic data types, array and hash, are much more first-class citizens in languages like JavaScript and Python and Ruby than they are in Java. And that always sort of throws me for a loop. And it's something I've gotten really, really used to, just being able to take an array, say, bam, it's an array. That's the fundamental data type. We're going to use it all over the place. And
Yeah,
I mean, we're going to push, we're going to shift.
I almost never use arrays. I just always use the lists. So I generally don't, which is why I'm always fumbling around with converting them. What's annoying is that the varargs is basically an array. So I tend not to use varargs as much anymore either. I just expect a list, and it's pretty. The syntax for passing in a list is a few characters. So yeah, so I don't even think about arrays anymore. I just think about natural data structures or lists and maps and
we could do that on line 19 of the test, but I do like the way it reads now.
Yeah, I mean, if we were to convert it, the additional, it would be basically that much more.
Yeah. But I like that we've pushed that implementation down because it does seem like a detail that we'd be repeating.
I agree that it's worth a little bit extra effort to reduce the noise in the test, which is of course what we're going to be reading most often. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, the thing with the nullables is you implement it once and you use it over and over and over and over again.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's an embedded stub. And I basically think about it the same way when I create the actual separate test stubs, is that you create them once and then you use them in, I use it in 50 different tests. Yeah.
Now there is one other thing I would do here, and I wouldn't write a test for it. But in that else clause in line 64 of your production code, I would probably do an assertion, like a runtime sanity check, just to fail fast. If the value is not between 1 and 6, I would say, hey, you gave me an invalid value. Because what we don't want to do is write tests that assume that the random die roller is going to create a 20 and say that we got a critical hit in our Yahtzee game.
Right.
And we'd have that test work all the way up and through to the point where we actually start doing it for real. So I do put some just sort of safety checks in my code, but I don't bother testing it because it's just to prevent programmer error. It'd be value between 1 and 6 because we're getting them.
So I'll use a legal automatic section.
Pass the value through in the message if you can. And then line 65 should definitely be less than 1, not less than 0.
Oh, right. And that's why I would write a test for this, because I'm terrible with comparison, especially with anything more complex than just a greater than or less than. So let's actually manually test that. So this should fail on 0. And this is okay with 1. Except for our expectation. Okay.
Yeah.
So what was it?
Yeah, I pepper my code with these runtime exceptions.
Yeah, I generally I refactor this to make it more clear. Whoops. So I would do something like that's messed up. Something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I usually have a little class that I put in with static methods that sometimes I call it assert, sometimes ensure, sometimes require.
Yeah.
We require dot that value
Yeah.
and then an explanation.
Yep. Yeah, I use require for it has to be this before I do anything, and ensure if it has to be this when I exit. So Lexler says it really bugs me that you're returning 0 on line 62.
I wonder. So Lexler's, what would you rather it return?
Because it is a stub, so it's sort of the default for the stub. I can see that there's a little bit of the lack of visibility. Well, so 0 is fine because 0 is within the bound of what nextInt is. So nextInt technically returns 0 and 5 Lexlers. So the 0 is correct, but for me, the only thing that's a little bit like, if I'm looking at just this test, right, that it's not clear why would I expect a 1.
Yeah.
So I might require, if I'm going to have a programmable, I might require it to always have a value.
So I started out doing that, and the reason you don't want to do that is because there's some tests that don't care what the value is, and having to specify it every time gets really tedious, and it actually makes your test harder to read. Well,
that's
and
fair.
That's fair. A good example is you've got tests that are using random die roller right now, not using a stub,
right?
Because for whatever reason, it doesn't care what result comes back, but you need to have it. So I always create null factories always work if you pass them nothing, and the way I set them up is that they will always work in a sort of sensible way. They won't throw an exception. They won't if it's returning values, they will return values that can be parsed appropriately. It will return legal stuff,
right,
that your test can then, your code will run without issues. And then if you really care what's happening, then you specify.
Right. No, I totally agree with that. And if this test didn't care about the role, then I would be fine with that. Yeah.
Yeah. And the only reason it does care about the role is because we're sort of specifying that behavior.
Right. We're basically saying that by definition, if you don't specify it, so we could change the test, say null roller returns 1 when not configured.
When not configured, yeah.
That makes it more clear that oh, I see what you're doing. Yeah.
Now something that I do, which is easier in JavaScript because we've got like 3 million different ways of saying doesn't exist, is that if it's not passed in, then it will default to a certain value. But if it is passed in, then it will do what it says. And when it runs out, it will throw an exception. So it would actually do 6, 3, 4, 3. And then the next time you asked it to roll something, it would say, I've run out of values. I don't know if I don't really think that putting that in here is going to be beneficial in this
Well,
case.
it'll throw out an exception anyway, because if we try to do a remove.
Nope, because of line 61, we'll see that there's nothing left and it will
Oh,
return
that's
0.
right. We did that. Yeah.
Yeah.
We could, yeah, there's ways to do it, but yeah, I agree. It's probably not
I
worth
just
it.
don't think it's worth it
Yeah,
in this
yeah.
case.
Hey,
So yeah,
Silverlight. Silverlight. Oh, wow. Thanks for your Prime Game sub. Nice to see you.
So yeah, I think we're done with this.
Cool.
So if you you want to check this in, well, actually, let's scroll up and just look at it as a whole now. I think it's basically done. And although there's a lot of ugliness in that embedded stub, and a lot of sort of sophisticated behavior that's used only by the tests, and again, that makes some people unhappy. Silverlight, thank you for not running away in disgust. My excuse for this is that once you've done it once, you set it aside, you never look at it again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'll admit, having what is basically code meant for tests in production code makes me a little anxious, but not so much so that I wouldn't consider doing this.
It used to bother me, but I cried myself to sleep for a couple of years, and now it doesn't bother me anymore.
Yeah, you found a coping mechanism.
I got over it.
Sure. Ikopor, we can't return an option on next int because the key part here is we're treating this as if it's the real thing, and that would require changing the interface on random, which we can't do. John says quite a few tests use a stub, but use this instead. Yeah, I mean, we probably won't do it because it's just mechanical, but that's the idea.
No, I think we should do it because that's the whole reason, is that now we can get rid of the stub and we can get rid of the port. We don't need
that's right. That's the key, is we can get rid of the port. Right. All right. That's right. So let's do commit if we feel happy with this.
Yeah, I'm happy with this. So what did we do? We it's not the embedded stub, that's an implementation detail. We allowed made the null die roller configurable.
All right. Great.
Okay. I don't know about you. I have to take a stretch break.
I was going to say this is
I
would say let's take a 5-minute break.
Okay.
Is that good?
All right. Thanks everybody. We'll be back in a few minutes.
Live Coding says it's unfortunate to have a random number generated in a test. It always makes things weird and fake seeming. It does. So that's why we're not going to stop with this example. We'll finish off this example, and we've got other things we're going to do that are probably a bit more interesting than random number generators.
It's a nice place to start because the implementation is so simple that we can work with that.
Yeah.
And there was also a question, are we going to refactor from Hexagonal? There's not that much difference between Hexagonal and the A-frame or imperative shell functional core.
Right.
I don't know. I forget. Does Gary say functional core imperative shell or imperative shell functional core?
I don't know. I just know
I want to say
two
it's
parts.
functional core imperative shell, but I keep saying it the other way around. Anyway, there's not that much difference. It's really just sort of more of a philosophical difference, but I think done well. That's the thing, is all these things done well end up being kind of the same. The major difference, I'd say, is that if you're doing something like a layered architecture, that may be also called onion architecture, but I'm not clear on exactly what onion is. If you do a layered architecture where your logic depends on the infrastructure, that's pretty substantially different.
Right. Well, yeah, and actually onion, clean, and hexagonal are similar in the way I look at it is in two ways. One is they are layered, but instead of sort of top down, you go outside in. So the point of view shifts to put the domain at the center, which I actually think is really, really important. But onion also inverts just like clean, just like hexagonal. And this is what Lexer is talking about in the chat. It inverts the dependencies so that your domain code does not rely on the infrastructure.
Yeah, so it's all basically the
Yeah,
same
yeah,
idea, because what we found is that having your logic, whether that's a domain-driven design, a transaction script architecture,
right,
however you define your logic,
right.
having your logic depend on external state gets really, really complicated.
Yeah,
And it works well when you're not trying to test it, because it's nice saying that I'm going to encapsulate, the outside world. And I used to, I programmed that way for years. And there is a certain appeal to saying, hey, when I talk to the contact, I don't and I ask it for its name, it doesn't matter to me if it gets it from a database or if it just hands it to me. Like, it's all encapsulated. That's nice, except for the fact that talking to the database takes a lot longer.
right.
And also, if once you start getting into testing it, it gets really, really annoying.
Hmm.
And then that's where you have to have these really complex dependency injection frameworks and all the magic that comes along with that,
Yeah,
that makes your life miserable in a large, complicated system.
yeah, yeah.
I like Live Coding's comment that onion architecture is defined as the thing that makes you cry when you cut into it.
There. So
Um,
it's interesting because the thing I like about hexagonal versus onion or the other one, um, I don't like that term clean. So
Clean, yeah,
I don't really
yeah,
use it. But um, what I like is I actually like the separation of the different pieces of the adapter wrappers, whatever you want to call them. I actually like that separation. I found that.
that what I called bureaucracy.
Yeah, what you call
The
bureaucracy, I call like I like things nice and organized, and
right.
so it's very very interesting
Well,
to see it that
so
way.
that's interesting. It would be. I don't know if we're going to have a case where we can compare those two or not. It would be nice to do that. Um, my my feeling, not having, I've not actually worked with a system that did that sort of strict separation. And one thing that I know from code is that you cannot evaluate ideas in the abstract. You have to
Yeah,
see what it's actually like when you actually
yeah,
do it. And that's why I'm sort of a, well, do what works, because the right thing just depends. But I know that when you have less experience, especially beginners, they need sort of, I'm not saying you have less experience, obviously, Ted, but I'm saying that beginners,
right.
they do need something that's prescriptive.
Yeah,
And in a really large system, you want a little bit, with a lot of people who are trying to coordinate, you want a little bit less, this felt right to me at the time, and a little more, this is the way we do things here.
right.
But it is a fine line,
Yeah.
because this is the way we do things here, when it doesn't
Yes.
apply, leads to a big, big mess.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I always say, like, and I think Martin Fowler said it way back when, is sort of as you sort of increase the number of people and or distance, you sort of have to increase formality. Um,
I think it's more
and
about distance than people.
and yeah, so I think it's, but I think this sort of same way applies. Like the formality or ceremony has its place, but definitely the that's the way we've always done it. Is I always rebel against that. It's like
It's a little dangerous as well,
it's
yeah.
because
So so my
that's how you prevent change, right? We've always done it that way. Well, that doesn't work anymore. Well, we've
So
always done
hopefully
it
we
that
can
way.
find an excuse to do, sort of that, again, my term, bureaucratic approach, that we can do the hexagonal, like, one external system that we separated out, and we can do it the A-frame architecture way, where we keep it together in a single adapter. My gut feel going into it is to say that when you're dealing with the same thing, it's nice to have your pieces together. Um, and that I would like that more than having it separated out. But I want to see what it's actually like
Hmm.
before I really say that's true.
Right.
And I think that willingness to accept that you're wrong is what you see from people who've been around the block,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And that's,
I know.
yeah, and that's why I stream, is like I'm always like uh, I want like one of, so I have two primary reasons why I stream, and those who've watched me long know these reasons. One is it's so much more fun to work with other people, even if they're just chatting. But the other is I've been doing this for a while, and I want people to know that experts make mistakes, have wrong assumptions, and that's just the way, and look stuff up on our search engine.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, there's it is impossible to have been programming for decades and not have a certain amount of humility, because the computer is going to hit you in the face
Yeah.
over and over with, you thought you knew what you're doing and you were wrong.
Right.
And if you've worked with a number of systems, eventually you get to the point of realizing, actually, none of this really matters. There's a lot of ways. For example, I am biting my tongue because you put line 21 and 22 in your test on separate lines. And like I'm looking at that, like, but you know what? It doesn't really matter. It
Yeah.
just does not matter. And Matt's got Prettifier set up. Matt Wynn, of course, the guy I'm pairing with, Cucumber guy. He's got his Prettifier set up so he strips all the semicolons. And I'm like, but you know what? Fine.
Right.
It doesn't matter. It just does not matter. You gotta be able to go with the flow and work with what is in front of you.
Yeah, because there's so much other stuff that actually does matter, and this is why, like, we've all seen in sort of code reviews the nitpickiness. It's like, you know what? Look, we decided on a standard. That's it is. Can we look at the stuff that's actually more important? Like, is this correct? Does this make sense? Yeah.
I tell this story a lot. Early on in my career, I think had 5 years of experience at this point. I was a team lead, and I had a team of 4 people, including myself. So it was a very small team. And we got together to establish our working agreements and talk about coding standards. And everybody had their own strongly held opinions about braces, of course.
Of course.
And I was like, you know what? We've spent half an hour discussing this, and we're obviously not going to get anywhere. It doesn't matter. As team lead, I declare it doesn't matter. Use whatever you want. The only rule is, if you are in a file that somebody else has worked in, match their brace style. Now let's talk about something important, like
Right.
how are we going to handle nulls? How are we going to, how are we going to do our naming?
Yeah.
What's our architecture going to look like? And we went on and we did that. Of course, nobody followed the rule of follow the existing style. They all did their own thing. There were files that had multiple different brace styles in them. You know what? It didn't matter. It didn't matter. What mattered was that we had this was Java, so we had a standard for runtime exceptions versus regular exceptions. We had a standard for what we did about nulls, kill them with fire. We had things that actually made the code easy to work with. You can adjust to trivial syntax, styling issues, if you let yourself not treat it like a religious war.
Exactly.
Anyway.
Yeah, it's actually kind of funny because, like, I used to use 2-space indents because it's like, oh, I wanted to sort of maximize for whatever. Then that was actually became a standard at some company I worked with. But I switched to 4 because I found that it was a bit easier to read. And now I'm thinking of like going to tabs. It's like,
right.
I
use tabs so that whoever's using it can just decide for themselves.
And so the actual thing that sort of tipped me over the edge was partially that, but also partially from an accessibility standpoint, because it's much easier for those who are blind or have other visual impairments, that it's actually easier for screen readers and other things to deal with tabs. The other reason is I want to go to much deeper, wider indents, because like, if you indent more than once or twice, it should be off the screen. You should be really annoyed and want to not do that. So optimizing for, I don't want you to indent very much because that makes things really hard to work on.
Right. I do find it's easier for me to do things right if I'm committing my future self to something. Like present self is pretty lazy.
Yeah.
Past self, of course, is an idiot.
Yes.
And future self can take all the blame.
That's
And
right.
so setting rules that commit my future self to do stuff that I don't really want to do is really effective way for me to make myself do stuff. That's why past self, of course, is an idiot, because he makes me do all this stuff
Like,
I don't want to do.
Damn you.
But anyway, yeah, let's go ahead and change all of our uses of stub. I know it's going to be a little mechanical, but let's just quickly go through and is there a way to do it automatically, or do we just have to go find them?
I think this is actually funny. I may override, well, let's see. So let's see
We might want to just make it a list rather than if you're already using it.
You know what? a smattering of usages. So let's just do it mechanically or manually. So,
but you were just talking about how you like to use lists a lot, so it's funny that we saw that
yeah.
come through.
So
I think we could do a global search and replace of new stub die roller
yep.
parenthesis list dot of parenthesis. Oh, except then we've got the parentheses on the other side to deal with.
So one thing I've noticed during this pairing stream is if it were just me, I would have enough brain energy to do this with some of the magical refactorings that I know. But I am finding like communicating with another human being in real time is using up some of that energy, and so I'm just going to do it the old-fashioned way.
Sounds good to me.
Because there are a couple of maneuvers I could do, but I'm not gonna do that. So what we want to do, let's just try one. So instead of this, whoops, that's not what I wanted. Doing that in the wrong order. We want to say, in fact, it's just a die roller. And so this should just be...
Actually, let's make it a random die roller because we're going to get rid of
right
the interface.
Yeah, let's do that. And then this is going to be... random die roller. We don't want to create, we actually want to create null. Is it not?
It's interesting that it can't find create null. Did we not make that public?
It's not public. Now it is. All right. So let's run our test just to be sure.
That should work, right?
It should. And it does.
Yeah, nice.
All right. So
I love how fast that is. That's really nice.
So this is technically this one down here should really be create null.
Yeah,
because this one is we don't care, right? It's what you're talking about before. It's like it's the we don't care one, but it actually we do want the non-real thing. So here's a stub die roller. So let me go and click up that. That. Where else is this used? Our dice roller test. So let's see. Well, that's interesting. So here I've got a hand-rolled lambda-based anonymous implementation of the die roller.
What is going on here?
So this must have been before I had my programmable stub roller.
Right.
So this multiple rolls should use die roller.
So yeah, we should be able to replace that
totally.
whole thing by just saying, not the dice roller.
Sorry, yes. So let me extract that out. Pull that out to die roller.
Yeah. We should be able to replace that whole thing with with random die roller.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think, what is this actually testing? Because this multiple rolls should use die roller. It's interesting. This doesn't.
You know what I would do?
Okay. Yeah.
I would just change it, run the test, and see if it still works.
Yeah, that's what I'm gonna do. So let's go from here. Do that. And that, and let's run it. Yeah, great. And so this one, let's pull this out. And then we'll do that. And same thing here. Actually, this one I'll just do random die roller, create null with 4. That works. It's funny. I'm expecting to hear a bell because I'm so used to like seeing you on the screen and seeing and when you run your stuff, the little tone goes off. So there's some ding. It's like, yeah, please ding for me, thank you.
Right. So it's basically what you're saying is I've trained you like
Yes,
Pavlov's dog
exactly.
To
expect a ding as a positive.
Right. I tell you, I originally created those dings for my stream because I was assuming that I wouldn't be able to have my terminal on screen at the same time as I had my code. And I wanted people to see that the test was passing or failing without me having to show it, right? But then I started using it in my own actual regular work, and I love it.
Yeah.
I love being able to hit save and have the ding go off, and I don't even look.
Yeah.
Like if it says it was successful and I expect it's successful, I just keep on rolling. It's so nice.
That's one of my favorite things. One of my favorite things. And I'm trying to figure out a way to do that in IntelliJ. There's an open issue for being able to execute things automatically after the test run. You can do stuff before, but there's nothing you can hook into to be done after it actually ran the thing, which is
right. Of course, what I have is I have a little watch script that detects when a file changes and then runs the tests. I'm not using the IDE to run my tests at all.
Yeah, and I had a setup for that using Maven and a little watch thing and a little bash script that I got from someone. The problem is that takes longer to run because it's using Maven, whereas IntelliJ caches a whole, right? That's why these tests run so quickly, because it's cached all sorts of stuff.
I love the speed. I mean, I think feedback is so important. If you can get it down to less than a second for your standard feedback, it just makes everything go smoother.
All right. Only one place left. It's over. So. And then actually, so that's probably look for all the creates. There should only be one actual create. All the other creates should be create null.
Before you do that, let's check in because I feel like this is a significant enough chunk that it's worth checking in on.
Sounds good. Let me just run all the tests because I haven't run those in a while.
And these are actually doing like,
yeah. So the way I have the test structured is I put little tags on the ones that involve Spring, basically. And those I don't run as often. All right, so let's do commit. So what do we want to say we've done? We have replaced
converted stub die roller calls to use null random die roller.
Random die.
Yeah. Or maybe uses of stub die roller. Yeah. I think that's good.
I'm going to say replaced.
Nice.
All right. Great. All right. Yeah, so let's go replace all of these create.
And this should be pretty easy because it's just going to be mechanical create to create null.
Yeah. So I'm going to do that and then basically. I so rarely use a global replace. I'm like, what's the keystroke for that? So I'm always refactoring in some way. So replace all. Yep.
Nice.
Okay. Change that back.
I really appreciate how you know your IDE so well, Ted.
it's yeah. I find that anything I can do so that I don't have to think about the mechanics, that I can think about what I'm actually trying to do, is that's the way I like to think about it. Is I want to preserve all that brain energy on like solving the real problems.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I agree. Okay, I
So
think
yeah,
that should be all of them, right? Do you want to
yeah,
do you want to
I'm
do
gonna
another find usages just in case?
yeah, yep, that's the only usage.
Excellent.
So did I run the tests? Let me run them again. They're so
So
quick.
Lexler's is asking, in hexagonal architecture, adapters translate between external classes and classes used in the domain. Do you do that in app in your A-frame architecture? Um, so there's one piece of this that I haven't described yet, which is value objects. And I will allow my infrastructure classes to return value objects. And
Mm-hmm.
then my logic classes will take value objects. So for example, the infrastructure might return, in this case, die rolls. And I might have die rolls defined as a value object that have no real business logic associated with them and are just
Mm-hmm.
basically the list of dice.
Right.
Um, and that is, I think, somewhat of a judgment call, like where do you do that? So basically data transfer objects can go between the infrastructure to the logic, but nothing with behavior goes between them. I don't
Mm-hmm.
know if that answers your question or not, but
Yeah. So what about things that are not value objects? So for example, I guess the typical thing is database,
mhm.
right? So in hexagonal, I do the transformation of when I store it, I do it from the domain object, which is probably going to be an entity, and there are going to be some value objects. How that gets transformed into whatever is suitable to store in the database, that's the adapter's job. It does that, and then when I find it, what I get back from that thing is a domain object.
Yeah, yeah, and that's a fairly substantial difference between hexagonal and A-frame,
Mm-hmm.
in that there is no communication. Like the infrastructure cannot be and is not aware of how the logic works. So the way I would handle that is it's a trick I learned many years ago when I actually was on a project where we had to roll our own database mapper because they didn't really exist at that point. And we went through but we were using extreme programming, and so we iterated and we refactored and we did multiple architectural refactorings, and we ended up with a structure where the domain object contained a data structure that was returned by the database, and that actually ends up being really powerful.
Yeah, so that sounds like the memento pattern.
It might be, I don't know, I've never heard of that pattern, but
So that's actually what I do. I can show you an example of that if you want, or we can leave that for another time.
let's leave it for another time
Yeah.
because I kind of want to keep going on what
Because
we've got here.
because we're gonna hopefully we'll get to the point where we can do a little bit of database stuff.
Yeah, I'd love
Stream.
for
So
us to just
yeah,
make this yacht program a complete abomination where it's doing all kinds of silly, dumb stuff like storing stuff in a database and calling services and really exploring like the limits of these architectural ideas.
right.
But basically what I would do in that case is the database would return, for example, a contact with their name and phone number and address and everything else as a pure data structure. You might call it a DTO, although I don't love that terminology. And then the application would just turn around and say, okay, I'm going to make a contact domain object and I'm going to give it the DTO. And the contact domain object is not going to copy that data. It's just going to store it. And then whenever it wants the data, it will go get it out. And then when it's time to store it out, it will say, the application will say, give me your data. And it will say, whoop, here you go. And
so
then,
you do know the memento pattern. That's the memento pattern.
I guess I do.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's actually, so that's pretty much what I do. It turns out.
So John CVV says, did you remove the stub-based?
I'm glad he reminded
us back on track.
Yeah.
And Live Coding says, don't forget to integrate with Salesforce, which I think now that it's been mentioned, Cthulhu has been called from the deeps, and now we have to. We have to do the Salesforce implementation integration.
I do a lot of training at Salesforce, and they've got some good people, and so
So
they
we
have,
won't make fun of Salesforce.
so no, we'll make fun of them. Just not too much fun. Do we want to delete the stub?
I think we do. I think we're ready.
Are we
Did
ready?
you check in after that last set of changes?
I don't think I did, so let me do that. This time we replaced random
Test usage.
list.
Or yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And I don't think that was strictly necessary, but I think it makes things a little bit cleaner. And it's
Yeah.
really nice to be able to find usages on create and find
see
like the actual
exactly,
production code.
Right. I agree. All right, so let's go find stub die roller, which is over there.
So go ahead and bring up the project structure if you wouldn't mind.
Yep.
So what we should be able to do now is, now I do want to be really clear for folks watching, the nullables pattern is separate from A-frame architecture, and you can use nullables and still use hexagonal architecture or clean or onion or anything you want. You can even use it with layered architecture. In fact, there's a lot of advantages of using it with layered architecture, because layered architecture in particular has a lot of dependencies on infrastructure.
Right.
So we're doing both. We're doing nullables, and then we're using that to remove the stub dice roller because we don't need it, but we don't have. We don't have to remove. Well, we're going to remove the stub die roller, but we don't have to remove the port, which is what, just die roller, right?
Oh yeah, we're looking at the test, so yeah.
Yeah, right. We don't have to remove the port, but we're going to.
Right.
But I'm just saying we don't have to.
We don't have to. So let's do it. All right, so let's delete the stub die roller. Gone. Let's switch back to non-IO tests.
That should work, because if it didn't compile, if it compiles,
if it compiles, it works. I usually use running my tests as seeing if it compiles, because it's just as fast. Yeah.
Yeah. And then we should also be able to remove the port now.
So let's go. So who's using it? It looks like there is some usage of it. But we could, I assume, just replace this with the implementation.
We could, yeah. It's probably making you feel a little uncomfortable right now.
Yes, it is. Like,
yeah. Well, after we do this, I've got something to tell you that's going to make you more uncomfortable, I think.
Oh, great. All right. So,
I can only hope. I mean, if it's just happiness and roses the whole time through, it's no fun, right?
Yeah.
I'd still call it die roller.
Yeah. Okay. So let's refactor.
In fact, what I might do is rename random die roller to just die roller.
So this is going to be random die roller. Did I break anything?
Hey, Bartoloda.
Hey, okay, great. Nice to see you.
Another Expanse fan?
That worked. Okay. Like, all right. So where else is die roller used? Oh, well, it's using the imports. I'll clean that up. I wish IntelliJ would automatically clean up the imports. So now it's just used as the interface on the random die roller. Yeah. So
we can get rid of that too.
Get rid of that.
This is my favorite part. I love deleting code.
Oh yeah. And now we can get rid of this because it's no longer used. And then we can run our tests. Hey, Dota Attitude. Welcome. Well, oh, darn override. We don't need that. The port is gone. So let's go and delete the package.
Yeah, we're not gonna use those anymore.
All right. Just to be sure, on all our tests. All right. It
Okay,
all
let's
works.
check that in.
Let's check it in.
By the way, did you make a branch on this, or are we just completely blowing up your yacht?
Well, we're on the
project
mob branch, so
Okay.
yeah, so that's fine. When I merge it, I'll probably figure out what to do.
Okay.
So let's see. So
We just make a branch called James Shore bullshit and check it into that.
remove. So we removed.
Actually, let's rename random die roller to die roller
Okay.
before you check in,
Sure.
because I feel like that's conceptually all
Yep.
one sort of big piece.
So
Live coding says call the branch delete later when he's not looking.
oh, that's the test. Yeah, we'll go ahead and die roller tests. Sure.
Yeah.
That was the test we wrote. Yeah. Boy, look at all those other changes. Okay, so let's go. Removed stub. Removed die roller port interface and stub. Renamed random die roller to die roller. Anything else?
Yeah, I think a simpler message here might be something like collapse die roller inheritance tree to just use implementation or something like that.
Something like that?
Yeah. Or to only use nullable version.
Yes. All right. Keeping me on my toes with my commit messages.
You know, it's funny. I see people spend a lot of effort on their commit messages, and to me, that indicates some sort of communication flaws in the team. Like if you are spending a lot of time reading through old commit messages, I want to know why. It doesn't mean that there's something wrong, but it's one of those process smells. So it's funny that you're saying that, because so as a result, I don't spend a lot of work on my commit messages,
Right.
but I guess I do think about it a little bit.
Yeah, usually, especially when I'm on stream, I that's where I get a little bit lazy. Is like, I just did this. And move on.
Made a change.
Yeah, I don't say that.
I worked with a company where they really cared about commit messages, and they were using, I think, Perforce or something like. I don't think it was Perforce, but it was one of those corporate version control systems that had a lot of admin controls that sell really well and justify their high fees, right?
Yes.
So of course they had required, one of the ways they were going to require good commits was by, they put in a requirement that you had to have a commit message that had at least 3 words, right? And they had it configured that you had to have a checkout message and a check-in message.
Oh God.
Yeah. So
Just
what did
shoot
everybody
me.
do? What was the commit message that everybody used? It was A space A space A.
Oh, dang.
Which just goes to prove once again
Yeah.
that technical controls do not solve social
Nope.
problems.
Nope. And also it's always a people problem.
It's always a people problem. In this case, the people that were the problem were the managers.
Yes. Yeah.
Because requiring a checkout and a check-in message, it just devalued. Like, I think people would have put effort into the check-in messages if they didn't have to also do a checkout message.
Right. Like, oh my God. Yeah, I would have put the A's all in caps.
Right. All right. So here's something I want to share with you. that I'm seeing in this code.
Oh, one
So
more
we've got
thing.
die roller.
This, what package should this now go in, actually?
It's still an adapter, I think.
Okay, so I just want to make sure that, that's where it makes sense.
Yeah,
Okay,
but
yep.
that relates to my next comment. So if you could collapse, let's look at the application. So you have something called dice roller,
Yes.
which depends on die roller.
Mm-hmm.
Can you pull that up? Let me take a look at my notes. Yeah.
Sorry, there we go.
Hmm.
So this is a change since the code you've seen. This is a change I did yesterday. So if you're
Okay.
confused, that's what's going on.
No, I mean I didn't really
Okay.
study because I wanted to come into it fresh, so
Okay,
I didn't
good.
really study the code
Good, good,
prior
good.
to
So you
us
didn't waste your
starting.
time.
So tell me about dice roller. What is it, and what makes it application level in the hexagon versus domain level in the hexagon?
So dice roller, and so this is literally what I did yesterday, is dice roller was in domain, but because it had a dependency on something that was external, so it had a dependency on the adapter, my rule, and this is my rule, domain must not depend upon anything else outside of domain.
Yeah, and I really hate that you have that rule because now there's not that much difference between your hexagonal and my A-frame, because that is one of the differences is
Yeah.
that hexagonal does tend to allow that dependency. And so it's a much more interesting
Well, hexagonal is agnostic to that.
right.
So, because it's like, what is hexagonal? It's not like Alistair wrote some great amount of detail of the nuances of all this
Right.
stuff. This is stuff I've discovered over the years. I mean, it's only within the past actually couple of years that I realized, what probably maybe you've known for many more years, is
I wouldn't count on it.
is the port dependencies of the port. The dependencies on some basically the outside world should not even be apparent. They should, like, the domain has no idea the outside world exists. It's sort of the way I look at it. And this was really annoying when I was making this change yesterday, because it's like, oh, I have to move this around. But it turns out, I think this is so much better, because what is actually needed is just, here's a bunch of random numbers. Like, I don't actually need to care where they came from, whether a service was providing it or not. So yeah, so I that was what will be interesting is there's another application that I use with an ensemble that I run, the game of blackjack. There, it's going to be tricky because we're going to have to do the same process, but it's not just random numbers; it's a shuffled deck.
Right, right.
So yeah.
So what you're talking about is really the essence of what A-frame architecture is all about, is
Yes.
that pulling stuff out of the logic and sort of inverting things.
Yeah.
Like it's very common. Like I was surprised when you said that domain couldn't depend on the ports, because that wasn't my understanding of how hexagonal worked. But I'm very willing to admit that I don't know how hexagonal
Well,
works.
again,
So
nobody defined it that way.
right.
Well, certainly the creator of it did not define it that way. But it didn't, like, when Alistair wrote about it, it was basically application was in the center. There was no differentiation between stuff inside of it.
And that is, I'm not very bureaucratic, but that is the one strong requirement that I make, is that logic and infrastructure do not get to know about each other.
Right.
And that leads to some really interesting results.
Yeah.
And exactly what you found is that when you try to pull that out, it makes you think about your domain in a different way.
Yeah.
And it does require, and it's not easy. It requires a little bit of a twist of the brain.
Yeah. It like, I've been doing this for a while, and I was struggling yesterday. It's like, what is this going to look like? And I remember reading an article by J.B. Rainsberger, talking about something related to this. It's like, how do you, it may have been exactly random numbers. Instead of passing in something, an interface that can fetch random numbers for you, just give them the random numbers.
Exactly.
And I feel like I keep having to make this breakthrough of like, don't give me something that I can call and get stuff. Just give me the stuff.
That's exactly the twist in the brain that you need in order to do A-frame architecture. Is don't give me something that will call.
Yeah.
Just give me the stuff.
Yeah.
Similarly, for my website, I ended up building my own HTTP server because when I first did it in 2012, I was for a screencast called Let's Code JavaScript, and I wanted to really know how to do JavaScript. So I'm like, I'm not going to use a third-party tool. And originally I wrote that so that, just the way all these HTTP frameworks work is that when a endpoint was called, it would call a get method and it would pass in a thing that you would then say, serve this result. Years later, did I mention that I'm slow? Years later, I'm like, well, wait, why pass in a thing that I call? Why can't I just return the thing that's supposed to be served?
Right.
I'm going to return a status code, some headers, and a body. That's all HTTP is.
Right.
If I return it, it makes everything easier. And so that functional core, pass in the stuff you care about, return the stuff you care about. It's a different way of thinking about the world, but it makes your life so much easier. And I did refactor it because I had good test coverage. I could do this. I did refactor so that now it just returns the result. And it's made everything so much cleaner.
Yeah.
Lexler says in the chat, it's interesting how you guys got to a very similar result after playing with the architecture. Yeah. I think there are some sort of universal things that
feels that way.
Help push you towards if you're thoughtful about it.
Exactly that. And that's what I always talk about when I talk about hexagonal architecture. It's not like I picked it up, and saying, oh, it sounds nice. I backed into it because I kept pushing deliberately and sometimes with great thought. How do I make this more testable? Mm-hmm. And after playing with it and reading a bunch of different things of how do I now organize the code, hexagonal seemed to fit, but it was still too ambiguous in terms of and 5 different people explain it 5 different ways. And so I'm now the 6th different way, but I always talk about is testable, that's why it's like, make your code testable with the hexagonal architecture. Yeah. The testability is the primary. And so, it's really interesting but I think you're right. I think it's not surprising that if you really push on, and I think that requires a lot of awareness. And I think this is what I push to the people I coach is like, try to notice that little like, oh, this is really awkward to test. Don't just, God forbid, create a mock and use Mockito and create a tool. It's like, pay attention to that. And what can you twist and turn to make it more testable? And you'll end up with something nice.
And it's that discipline that is so rare. Yeah. Like people have a task and they are there to solve the task as quickly as possible. Yeah. And so they throw in Mockito and they make their lives miserable. They make everything slower. I'm not saying that mocks are bad. They are another technique. Right. What's bad is not thinking your way through it. Right. And so they will just like brute force it, and they end up with, those, you've seen those tests where there's dozens of lines of mock setup and then a call and then dozens of lines of declaration. And you end up later on, you look at it and you say, oh my God, the test is testing that the test works. Right. Right. It's not.
It's not. And you may not even realize that until something.
And I can't refactor.
Yeah, and you may not realize until something breaks, and it's like, why didn't the test catch it? Oh, because the test was testing itself. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So live coding asks, when is the next stream? So our plan is to continue during this time period until James gives up.
Which will probably be until the end of the year-ish. Yeah. I do have some work that I expect to get very busy on starting at the beginning of the year, but we'll see what happens. Yeah. I'm having a great time, Ted. So thank you for hosting me. Yeah. Which reminds me, speaking of hosting, if any of you watching know how I can set up my channel, which is James Shore Live, to host this stream while we're streaming, I'd appreciate being given a link or told how to do that, because we looked into it for a few minutes before the stream started and couldn't figure it out. There's supposed to be a button. I couldn't find the button. So did I mention I'm a little slow?
We can also figure that out at the end of the stream. You can share your screen and I can see what's going on.
Yeah, I can take a couple minutes on it, but I do have somebody coming over shortly after. Yeah. But I would maybe before next stream we can figure that out as well.
Yes, we'll figure that out before next stream.
So Lexers, I think it would be very cool to have a full-blown version of this in A-frame. Yeah. And that is where we're going to go.
That's where we're going to go.
That's a good segue for what I wanted to say to you. And John CVV is kind of getting at it. It bothers me that both are called dice roller. So here's the thing. I'm looking at this. I don't think dice roller belongs in the application package.
Okay.
I think it's infrastructure. And I don't think die roll is doing enough to be worthwhile. I think dice roller and die roller should be combined.
So I actually sort of buy the second part. I don't buy the first part because, and I'm actually a little bit uncomfortable that dice roller is in application, but it's what I got to yesterday.
Right.
Because
Well, if your code was, if we had nothing to talk about, this would be a very boring stream. So don't apologize for getting to where you got. And it doesn't mean that my suggestion's right either.
No, but it is something that bugged me. So I'm actually glad you mentioned it, and that John Seaver brought it up, because there is a bit of, I think I still consider it. Well, let me put it this way. It's application of domain logic because it involves which dice are you not re-rolling.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not infrastructure, at least not all of it.
Here's the thing.
Yeah.
Again, going back to the A-frame architecture, infrastructure wrappers, which I'm fine calling adapters, that's another name, or a gateway. There's lots of names for these things. They are programmed, in my view of the world, which of course is perfect and right, and you must obey. In my view of the world, the purpose of the infrastructure wrapper is to put a pretty face on the outside world, and that pretty face does not need to reflect the outside world. What it needs to reflect is what we care about.
Right.
What makes infrastructure different from logic, the only real distinction is that infrastructure depends on external state, and logic may have state of its own, although pure functional is easier. But
fighting words.
Well, it's easier in some ways and harder in others.
Yeah.
I tend to like immutable objects. It's sort of a nice middle ground.
I do too. Yeah.
Yeah. But the only difference is that we need a place to deal with the stuff that has to deal with external state, and because it's so messy. Thanks for the suggestion, live coding. We did try that, and it didn't seem to work. Sorry, Dad. Squirrel. What was I saying, Ted? I've derailed.
You're saying that sort of infrastructure puts a nice facade, one might say,
right? Might say facade, yes.
on and that you don't care how it works.
Well,
or you don't.
I don't need it to exactly reflect the outside world.
Right.
I do want it to, I don't want to put logic in there that does a lot of stuff, but I am going to put some logic because remember, I'm very unbureaucratic. I'm very loosey-goosey. And sometimes it makes your code better overall if you put more stuff in the infrastructure than in the application or the logic. And this, I think, is one of those cases. If we have a dice roller in our infrastructure that we can say, give us X number of dice. That's to me how I would code it. I probably would not code it to keep track of which dice we had.
Right. So this is where I suspected that we agree, but we're just not clear on what we're disagreeing on. If you specify dice rollers, give me a bunch of dice. A bunch of rolled dice. Then I would agree. Sure, that's infrastructure. Whether I get 1 or 50, that's unimportant. What's important though in dice roller is that it takes the kept dice as a parameter and uses that to figure out based on a domain. This is why it makes me uncomfortable that this has it here. This is domain knowledge.
Yeah.
How many dice there
belongs. I think you've put in an application because that's
where I got it.
The middle ground.
Yes.
But I actually think you have two classes here. I think you have a dice roller that's infrastructure, and you have a dice rolls, or I don't know what the domain term is for your 5 dice.
Dice roll. Dice roll.
Well, I know you have a dice roll, but
so
is that your 5 dice?
That's the 5 dice.
Yeah, so that should be responsible for keeping track of the state. dice roller should be doing the dice rolls, and
I
dice
agree.
roller and application shouldn't exist.
Where were you yesterday?
So that's where I think we
Yeah,
should go
I,
next.
I I agree. Let's do
Yeah.
it.
All right. Well, we got 15
Oh
minutes.
yeah.
So, um, well, what we can do, so what we need to do, I'm sure you've experienced this. What I find is often the hardest in doing TDD really well is figuring out how to take your brilliant ideas and break them down into small steps, right? And keep the code
Small
working
steps and keep
every
the
step
code
of the way.
working. Yep. Many,
Yeah.
many more much smaller safe steps. Yep.
Oh, by the way, Ted, I'm really disappointed you're not wearing your hats
You
today. I
know,
was looking forward to that.
see, I've got the hat. I just can't put it over my headphones.
Oh, right.
And I
Yeah.
can't put
Because
my
we're
headphones on with the hat because otherwise I can't hear James, which,
right.
is kind of important.
Right. Well, it's questionable. Yeah, I guess normally you're on your own, so you don't have
Right.
the feedback.
Right. Right.
Yeah, I'm just hoping because I don't like the look of having the headphones on. I've I'm hoping that my microphone is tight enough that it's not picking up the feedback from
Well, I'm
the
going to try that next time.
screen.
Actually, this was just like I want to be sure that there's no feedback. But next
Yeah.
time we'll try it out where I'm not wearing the headphones and it's coming out of my speakers, and we'll see if that works. Because if that works, I also prefer not to look like a VJ, which
Yeah.
now
Well,
dates me.
if y'all are wondering why I'm making love to my microphone, that is why. Is I'm trying to keep it real tight. I actually bought this when my kids were small and streaming a lot because they were, 6 months old.
They do that.
And so I needed a way of streaming or recording that wouldn't pick up all that noise. So I've got a nice tight pattern on this
Yeah.
one.
Now we just use
Um,
AI to ignore all the screams.
they still showed up on the recordings, and in one of the comments there's like you can hear Jim's cat in the background. It's like actually that's not a
That's
cat.
not a cat.
Yeah. All right. So
So we were saying many more, much smaller steps, as
yeah.
GPaw
So
says.
what I would like to do is modify die. I think we can keep this code the way it is. We'll modify die roller to take a number of rolls that it wants,
Okay.
and then modify dice roller to use that. And then next time, because we'll run out of time,
Yeah.
then we can start looking at how we can evaporate dice roller back down into the domain layer.
Okay.
That's my thinking. And we have to have some way of remembering this because in a week I will remember nothing.
That's why I have recordings. Like, where did we leave?
Yeah.
We watched the last 10 minutes. So are we saying that we're going to modify, are we going to add a new method to die roller that is one that takes a parameter?
No, I think we're going to have it take a number of dice, and then we'll return that number of dice.
But wait, sorry. In,
Oh yeah, this I can't actually type. So working with Matt, we're using live coding,
yeah,
or in VS Code, or Live Share. Anyway, and we can both type at the same
right.
time. And
Yeah.
that's actually really nice.
It is
I do
nice. It
like
is
that.
nice.
The problem is the tools are kind of iffy,
Yeah.
and IntelliJ's code with me is not great.
IntelliJ's code with me is let's put a light editor and not really do what you actually want to do. There are other tools, and I think I mentioned this when there's FluBits, there's Code Together.
I've wanted to try Code Together.
We could try Code Together next time, not as a primary way of handing off, but as a way of pointing and highlighting. So that's something we could try. I'll make a note of that.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm reluctant to mess with the tech since we've got it working, but
well, it depends on how I've used it before. It generally works pretty well, but sometimes it can get lost. But if we use mob.sh as our primary handoff and just Code Together is just a way to type a couple of characters, I think it'll be okay.
Okay. Yeah, we managed to get Matt and I multiple times managed to get Code with me to hang in an infinite loop when we both followed each other. Like I followed him and he followed me, and it's so easy to do that accidentally.
Oh no!
And the whole system would just hang. It would lock up, presumably because it's like in some sort of infinite recursive loop. It's got a ways to go before it's a good tool. But anyway, to get back to the die roller, I'm not wedded to this, but what I was imagining was on line 24, we pass in a parameter which is num dice,
Okay.
and then we return a list of the dice. But sneaking up on it, we'd probably want to do that as an overload.
That's what I was
or
thinking.
maybe a
Yeah,
different method.
that's what I was thinking. An overload, because we can overload.
But can we overload and return a different return type?
Oh, that's right. We're returning something else. Yeah, so we can't overload. So it's going to
Yeah,
be a
so
different method.
let's just make roll multiple or something like that. And then I think ultimately we'll end up deleting roll.
So are we going to write a test, or are we just
Yeah,
going to?
absolutely.
Okay. So
In
to
fact,
sketch this out, we're basically saying we want. Do we want this to then return the dice roll?
why don't you hand off to me and I'll show
Sure.
you what I'm thinking.
Yeah. Let's do that. Mob next, not next.
Share
All right.
screen.
And I'll watch the windows bounce around. That actually
Okay,
worked.
does that hand off okay?
Look that way.
All right. So, whoops. Oh, I guess because things are renamed, it
Yes.
kind of lost everything. Die roller test and die roller.
So if you do the search for class and you hit Shift Enter, it actually opens that file in the split to the right.
Oh, that's helpful. Yeah. One of the things I love about pairing with people is I learn new tricks and
I can throw, as you can probably tell, I can throw all sorts of. So you used Command 1 to close the project window, which is great. If you have multiple windows open, Command Shift F12 closes all tool windows.
Oh, that's cool.
Because
Yeah,
often
because I've been
you
wondering
hand
how to
off
get rid
and
of
then
the
open the
terminal.
project, and now I have to close 2. You can do it with 1 keystroke.
The only problem is that
If you don't have the media keys mapped to
yeah,
FPs.
and you last time we talked, you told me a way of turning those off. Well,
Yeah.
unfortunately, it doesn't work for my external keyboard. It only works for my
What?
laptop keyboard. Yeah,
That's not
yeah, I know
right.
it's annoying. It's not.
Boo.
This is a solar keyboard though, a wireless solar keyboard with a
It's
full
wireless
size
solar keyboard. Wow.
numpad, and
Numpad.
those are hard to come by. So I'm
Combining
going
all
to cut
3
them
of
some
those, I
slack.
bet that's hard to come by. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a Logitech keyboard. I probably shouldn't hold it up because it's very yellow. I've had it for years and years. It's held up well. Okay, so what I'm imagining is, well, let me do a little bit of programming by intention here. Void something. I'm imagining something like this. We'll have a die roller, and we'll say roll multiple 3, and that will give us a list of dice that we can then assert that our dice are equal to, and I'm just,
Yep.
5, 8, and 2, like that.
Right.
And of course, we'll use our null version of our dice roller to check that roll multiple works.
Of course.
That's one of the neat things about the nullables is that because it's running the real code paths, we can actually use the nullables in our test and in the test of itself.
Of itself.
And know that we're doing something real rather than something fake.
Right.
So yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
Okay.
Let me go ahead and hand back to you
Sure.
to do the implementation.
All right. I'm going to grab the screen. Oops. Thank you, Zoom, for rearranging everything.
Yeah, and we've got about 9 minutes left, and I do need to stop right at 5. So do you want to leave any time for sort of retrospective type of thoughts?
I was actually going to pretty much just leave it where you had it, which will cause it to be failing.
Because that is not real code.
Because that's not real code. Hold on a second. Sorry, Zoom decided it wanted to switch. There we go. Okay. So let's see. So let me do a mob start. Okay. And
you're in dice roller. You want to be in die roller test.
Nope, not that one.
That's dice roller test.
There we go.
Yeah, I always dislike having classes that vary by a single letter because it's just too easy to confuse them.
So we're saying something like roller pen roll Provide
Yeah. How about just rolls multiple dice?
roller rolls. So
Oh, right. You like to have
actually,
it on multiple lines.
I'm gonna say it contains.
Yeah, and I assume what we'll return there is a list.
Yeah, so that's the nice thing about so this will be a list of integer. Is that what we're saying? So we'll start with integer, see how that goes, and then we'll leave it this way. So that seems like a good place to stop.
Okay. Well, let's flesh it out a little bit more, and
Okay,
let's pass in 5, 4, 3 to the die roller.
that makes it clearer. Yes.
Okay.
So one of the so assert that is an assert J library that has all sorts of great stuff for doing assertions. One of the reasons I use it over like some use embedded or hamcrest matchers is I don't find them discoverable from an autocomplete. So that's why I really like assert J. So this is in any order. Do we care about order?
We do. It
I think
needs
we
to be
do.
the precise order
Yeah.
that we specified.
So we want contains exactly. So this will say it better contain it 5, 4, 3.
Yeah, nothing else, nothing more, nothing
And
less.
nothing else, nothing more, nothing else in that exact order. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's
I
all
like that.
sorts of things you can do. You can say contains exactly. You can say it contains exactly in any order.
That's very nice. I
There's
like
all
that.
sorts of stuff. So, all right.
Got 5 minutes. We could implement it in 2 minutes.
No, let's leave it for as a cliffhanger so that people
Yeah,
will
no,
come back
I
for the
like that.
next.
And one thing I learned from Kent Beck, he tweeted about it or something like that. I didn't learn it from him directly. Is that he always likes to end a session with a failing test, because
Yeah.
then when he comes to the next one, it's just
Yeah.
like, bam, that's where we go.
Yeah.
Um,
I learned the same
but
thing probably from the same person. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I find that so difficult because, of course, often the hard part is writing the test, right? And then once you've written the test, like
Right.
implementing it,
Right.
it's going to
It's
be
like,
super
oh,
easy. You're like, just one more line of code,
right.
mom.
Right.
But no,
We'll resist that temptation.
well, you'll resist it, and I have no choice because you're in control.
That's right, because I own the keyboard.
That's right. But I would like it if you just put a to do or something as a reminder, so we don't have to watch the last 10 minutes of the video. Next question mark. Uh, uh, remove dice roller. Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Although I think we've already done the distributed work part. This roll multiple is it. Oh, and probably we want to also we might want to eliminate roll as well.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So we just have roll multiple is all there is.
That's right, because we wouldn't need it.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So thoughts? How'd this go for you?
I had great fun. This is a blast. I love pairing, and it's very rare that I get to pair with people who I'm not teaching stuff, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Same.
it's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
That's part of why I'm enjoying pairing with Matt. But by the way, if you all want to see more live streaming with me, or
If you
the
can't get
bigger draw
enough.
might be with Matt.
Yeah.
That will be next Tuesday, from 11 to 12:30. We're going to be doing some pairing on his GitHub activity, which is a little more nitty gritty than what we're doing so far here, but also almost done. So we've probably just got the one session left, but that will be November 29th at 11 o'clock a.m. Pacific, if you're interested.
Cool. That one I might actually be able to tune in for.
Yeah, that'd be great if you could come. Yeah. Um,
Oh,
so
hey,
yeah,
Hey, Jeremy.
I had a really good time.
Good, good. I'm glad because it's the same reason. Like I think it's rare for folks who tend to be coaches and trainers and educators and so on to be able to find someone who's where I like how you says like where you're not teaching sort of stuff that is not the content of what you're doing. So I had a blast.
Yeah.
I'm glad we did this, and I'm glad we're doing a bunch more.
Yeah, yeah, I'm really looking forward to getting into it further. I wish your code was worse because it would be more interesting, but
Sorry.
yeah.
I can go make some bad code. I can write some. It's really hard for me to write. I mean, it's funny. It's like it's really hard for me to write bad code.
Well, when I say worse, it's not really worse. I wish that you didn't have your rule about domain can't talk to pores,
Right.
because that would make the difference between the A-frame
Yeah.
architecture
Yeah.
and the other architectures,
Right.
the other variants of hexagonal
Right.
more clear.
Right.
But I'm glad we found this dice roller, because that is sort of an interesting
Yeah. So that
thing
I'm glad
we
that
can
stuck
explore.
around, because that is something that we can look at next time.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. But and thanks very much for everybody who has been watching on the chat as well. I believe I plan to put this up on my YouTube channel. I'm not sure if you plan on doing that as well,
Same.
Ted.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So we'll get that. And also on my website, if you go to the events chat, if you go to jamesshore.com and click the events link, it has this stream listed in there. And I'm going to link all the back catalogs and also talk a little bit about what we're going to do next in there. So you can find that as an archive.
Yeah, James is much more organized about that than I am. I'll probably have to figure out where to put it on my website, but I'm like,
Right.
I'll just point at James.
Hey, wouldn't hurt my feelings.
Yeah, yeah.
So I know what to write about what we're going to do next time. We're gonna do the dice roller stuff. That probably won't take us all 3 hours.
Yeah, no.
What else do you think we want to do that time?
So I have the external service. It's actually already running and deployed, of where you can send in information about, I rolled the dice and I scored it against a category. Mm-hmm. And so we can send that out as a notification event to the service. And in fact, I can show you what that looks like if you have time. If not, we can wait till next time.
Got a minute or two.
We can see that next time.
Yeah.
So that is, and I've written no code for that, but the spring part of it is really like a couple lines of code. So I was thinking maybe we just write that as a nullable from scratch.
Yeah, I'd be up for that. Now, if I'm writing an infrastructure wrapper from scratch, I'm also going to test it. And the way I test services is by, at least at the lowest level, I use a SPI server, which is an in-memory server, sort of like WireMock, except WireMock, I don't believe, is in memory.
There's stuff you can do, but it's not in memory.
If you can figure that out, so we don't spend a lot of time thrashing on it.
Yeah.
If you have time, that would be really cool.
Yeah. I'll probably do that on a stream. So, but yeah, I'll get something set up for that. Cool.
Excellent. All right. This has been fantastic. Thanks, everybody.
All right.
And guess we'll see you next time.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. And you've got the links for James. And of course, he's got a Discord too, but I've got a Discord. And it's my channel. So there's the Discord.
I'm going to hijack the chat for a moment. It is jamesshore.com/s/AOD2 Discord. It is
memorable
for my Discord.
So tune in next week. Follow us on Twitter, follow us on here on Twitch, and you'll be notified of when the next stream is. But it's same day of the week, same time. So join us, and we'll see you then.
2 to 5 p.m. Bye, everyone.
Bye.